Hey guys, tonight we drift into the salt-washed streets of Marseille. Not the postcard version with sunlit cafés and polished cobblestones, but the darker version that hums when the rest of France goes to sleep. We're headed to the docks, to the shadows between alley lamps, where one Corsican man turned vice into architecture. Paul Carbone. Ever heard the name? Maybe not. But if you've ever wondered how a port city came to run on heroin, silence, and whispers in backroom cafes, you're about to meet the man who made it happen. He didn't just run Marseille's black market. He built it like a cathedral. And you probably won't survive this story if you think gangsters only wear fedoras and mumble about honor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Mediterranean rolls soft against Corsica's shore, but inland, the hills of Ajaccio are sharp and quiet. It's here, in 1894, that Paul Bonaventure Carbone comes into the world, swaddled in sun, poverty, and a last name that would one day dominate smugglers' ledgers and backroom bribes. He's born to a family that barely scrapes by. His father, a dock worker turned customs officer, believes in structure, iron fences, hard lines, and rules carved into stone. But Corsica doesn't obey anyone's rules for long. Vendetta's last generations here. A wrong word can mean a knife in the ribs 10 years later. Even as a child, Paul learns to listen more than he speaks. When Paul is 6, his father dies under uncertain circumstances. Some say it was disease, others, something less natural. Many people still think that his father stumbled into something. Maybe a bribe gone wrong, maybe an old grudge rekindled. So what do you think? Either way, his mother doesn't last long after that. She breaks under the weight of widowhood, debt, and isolation. That leaves Paul, barefoot, small, and watching the world with eyes too sharp for his age. By 9, he's already earning his own bread. Not much. Shining shoes, fetching cigarettes for grown men with hollow laughs, carrying buckets for the fishmongers. But he moves differently than other boys. Quieter, calculating. The kind of child who hears things he's not supposed to. The kind of boy who watches drunk men gamble and learns odds better than they do. He becomes a runner between taverns, trusted to deliver notes, money, sometimes pistols wrapped in cloth. And he never asks questions, not out of fear, but because he knows that answers cost more than they're worth. Corsica, even then, is less a place than a mood. Sharp granite, Catholic guilt, and an endless horizon that never changes. Paul, restless, begins to look toward the sea. One summer, he stows away on a merchant ship bound for North Africa. He's caught just before Toulon and dragged back by men who recognize his eyes, but not his name. That Carbone boy again, someone mutters, always looking beyond the island, but the seed is planted. Paul starts learning maps like most boys learn prayers. He wants Marseille, not because it's glamorous, but because it's busy. Cities offer shadows, and shadows offer options. Corsica offers none. By the time he's a teenager, Paul has grown into wiry limbs and a reputation for stillness. He doesn't start fights, but he ends them with speed and finality. He begins working as a porter at the docks, moving crates of olives and wine, but always noting which ones are heavier than they should be. It's here that he begins to understand the difference between crime and business. One is dirty, loud, and fleeting. The other, What the older men are doing quietly with handshakes and false invoices, that's crime with a pension plan. He notices which crates disappear before customs officials arrive. He notes the ones marked with chalk symbols, known only to those who walk between the lines of legality. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Paul starts leaving his fingerprints on those crates. Not literal ones, he's too clever for that. But he starts controlling the chain. Just a boy. But the chain begins to move when he nods, and then comes the war. 1914 changes everything. Europe goes mad, and Corsica offers up its sons like every other corner of France. Paul enlists, not because he's patriotic, but because war promises movement. The military, ironically, gives him the legitimacy he needs. He's posted to Tunisia first, a place that will carve new paths into his life. The sun there feels different, harder. And the colonial posts are more about control than combat. He watches officers negotiate with warlords, watches local crime networks operate under the nose of French command, and for the first time, Paul learns that uniforms don't mean order. They mean opportunity. He starts moonlighting, carrying contraband between cities, arranging lost shipments, and translating between smugglers who speak French with too many accents. His name, already half shadow, becomes a whisper across certain cafés in Bizerte and Tunis. He's still barely 20, but the most important encounter doesn't happen in battle. It happens in a brothel outside Sfax, where Paul meets another Corsican, only a few years older, with a grin like a knife wound and knuckles that crack like gunfire. François Spirito. The meeting isn't planned, but it feels fated. Spirito's already running his own network, mostly women, some gambling, minor theft. But he sees something in Paul, not just intelligence, control. The kind of man who plays chess when everyone else is tossing dice. They talk for hours that first night, seated in a hot courtyard while women laugh behind shuttered windows. The air smells of rose water and blood. From that moment on, Paul and Spirito become inseparable. Partners in vice, brothers without blood. One plans, the other enforces. And while the war rages across Europe, the two Corsicans begin carving a quieter empire in the colonies. One crate, one girl, one corrupted official at a time. The war limps to its conclusion, and the world begins to rebuild with tired hands and shakier morals. By 1919, Paul Carbone and François Spirito return to France, not as veterans looking for medals, but as architects with blueprints already sketched in the margins of old war maps. Marseille greets them with the noise of post-war ambition. The docks groan under the weight of commerce and confusion. The black market, which swelled during wartime rationing, doesn't shrink with peace. It simply changes flavor. Food is no longer scarce, but desire is. For distraction, for danger, for things not allowed in polite society. Paul's first order of business is establishing footholds, not in buildings, but in people. He and Spirito begin recruiting among the disillusioned and the forgotten. Ex-soldiers with too much muscle and not enough memory. Young boys who grew up on street corners while their fathers died in trenches. And immigrants arriving in Marseille with hopes in their bags and nothing in their pockets. He doesn't promise them wealth. He promises them work, protection, a brotherhood, a purpose. They start small. Protection rackets near the port. Nightclubs where alcohol flows without taxes, and women are available without shame. The city, still wounded from the war, hardly blinks. In fact, it welcomes them, because Paul and Spirito know how to behave like gentlemen while profiting like gangsters. Paul insists their clubs look clean. mirrors polished, tables spaced with care, doormen in tailored suits. If you look like chaos, he tells Spirito, you invite chaos. If you look like order, you sell it. Spirito, ever the man of action, takes to managing the enforcers, hard men with cold eyes and warm trigger fingers, but Paul keeps the books. Paul meets the bankers. Paul sits with the inspectors over aperitifs and promises they won't need to make arrests this month. Because everything's so quiet, monsieur. And it is quiet, eerily so. The gang doesn't just grow, it settles. Like ivy on an old wall, it becomes part of the architecture. Police officers start turning blind eyes. Judges' children begin showing up at Carbone's events. Even the mayor's office finds itself unusually fond of Paul's civic investments, which include funding public statues and playgrounds, usually adjacent to buildings he owns. But it isn't all business. Paul's childhood left him with a kind of hunger, not just for power, but for control. Even in pleasure, he's meticulous. He doesn't drink heavily. He doesn't gamble wildly. While Spirito might leave a brothel with lipstick on his collar, Paul leaves with ledgers balanced and favors collected. Some nights, he walks the docks alone, smoking Turkish cigarettes and watching the cargo come in, wondering which crate hides his next opportunity. It's during one of these quiet walks that he stumbles upon a scuffle. Two men beating a young Algerian boy who'd apparently stolen bread. Paul doesn't interfere. He waits, watches, then approaches the boy later, once the crowd's dispersed. You steal like someone who hasn't learned how to ask, he says. The boy, bruised and shaking, asks what that means. It means, Paul replies, lighting a cigarette with studied grace, that you're poor now, but you won't always be. Come by the back of Café Dauphin tomorrow. Ask for me. And the boy does. That boy would later run one of Marseille's key opium routes, trusted like blood. Carbone remembers everyone he helps and what they owe him. By the early 1920s, Carbone and Spirito have become untouchable in their domain, and that domain stretches beyond vice. They begin moving goods, sugar, tobacco, textiles, even stolen coal rerouted during labor strikes. If it can be sold, it can be taxed. And Paul decides he'll be the one collecting. He also starts leveraging his Corsican connections. Marseille is a gateway, but Corsica is a safe house, a place where tongues don't wag and boats vanish into cliff-lined coves. He buys property on the island again, not flashy villas, but modest houses with cellars deeper than they need to be, places to hide men, or money, or memories. One historian once said that Carbone's real genius was not his ruthlessness, but his timing. He knew when to grow, when to vanish, and when to smile. And maybe that's why the authorities couldn't pin anything on him. Not yet, at least. One winter evening, Paul hosts a small dinner at his home in Marseille. Just a few people. Some local businessman, a theater owner, a police inspector whose name conveniently disappeared from 2 corruption files. Over cocoa van and cigars, Paul tells a story about a fisherman who sold more fish than he caught. Everyone laughs, but they all understand the message. Spirito, leaning against the fireplace, eyes glinting, adds, "Better to sell what people want than what you have." That becomes their motto. Unspoken, but evident in every decision. They stop asking what they can supply. They start asking what the city craves, and they provide it. Sometimes what the city wants is ugly, and Paul doesn't blink. Still, he maintains appearances. Every Sunday, he attends Mass. Every Easter, he donates to orphanages, often the same ones that unwittingly raise the street kids he'll later employ. He even sponsors art exhibitions. Yet beneath the cultural polish, Marseille darkens. The docks become zones of quiet lawlessness. Ships offload goods that don't appear on manifests. Warehouse fires conveniently erase records. And once in 1923, an entire customs office is burgled in the middle of the night. Not a single guard saw a thing. Some say they were paid off. Others claim they were too afraid to open their eyes. Many people still think that job was a test, that Carbone wanted to see if the city would defend itself. So what do you think? By 1924, Marseille has changed. Not officially, of course. The mayor still waves at parades. The police still issue reports. But beneath the civic pageantry, Paul Carbone rules. Not like a dictator, more like a conductor. His baton invisible, but every note perfectly timed. And if anyone questions how a former Corsican dock rat came to dine with judges and dance with actresses, the answer is simple. He didn't steal power. He built it, one silence at a time. Paul Carbone doesn't rise like smoke. He spreads like damp. Silent. Persistent. Unstoppable once he settles in. By 1925, Marseille isn't just his playground. It's his test kitchen. A city where vice can be refined, cooked, and repackaged for export. And behind it all, Paul is stirring the pot with one hand and shaking hands with bishops with the other. It's a strange duality, isn't it? You can spot him at Sunday Mass, rosary in pocket, eyes closed in practiced reverence. Then, hours later, he's overseeing a shipment of girls brought in from Eastern Europe. Orphans mostly, wrapped in lace and promises, bound for nightclubs with velvet drapes and no clocks, but he never sees it as contradiction. To Paul, morality is something for the daylight. His world begins after dusk. His partnership with Francois Spirito tightens during these years. They're opposites in surface texture. Paul, the gentleman strategist. Spirito, the enforcer with a jaw like a battering ram. But they share one key principle. No wasted movement. Every club they open, every deal they broker, every rival they silence, it's calculated. Spirito breaks the bones. Paul breaks the rules, but always cleanly, elegantly. No splatter, no noise. They begin expanding their reach beyond Marseille's underbelly. Paul makes visits to Paris, Lyon, even Geneva. Always business, though he's learned the art of making crime look like a cultural tour. Opera one night, opium deals the next morning. That's the rhythm, and behind each new relationship, be it banker, butcher, or bureaucrat, lies the same principle. Make them need you more than they fear you. Paul is very, very good at making himself useful. Take, for instance, the city's port inspectors. They work hard, sure, but their wages are low, hours long, and respect scarce. Paul offers them bonuses, quietly, in envelopes with no return address. At first, it's just to look the other way once a month, then twice. Then they stop looking altogether. One inspector even begins tipping Paul off when rival shipments come in. For a small fee, of course. Eventually, that inspector retires early, buys a vineyard, and never speaks of his port days again. Carbone never forgets such favors. He keeps lists, not written, but memorized. His memory is legendary, even among enemies. There's a saying among Marseille's underworld. Carbone forgets nothing except maybe mercy. Of course, not everyone bends so easily. In 1926, a new police chief arrives from Bordeaux, a man named Lefebvre. Clean-cut, reputation for integrity. The kind of man who won't accept gifts, even if they come wrapped in charitable intentions. At first, Paul tries subtlety. Invitations to local art galas, a tasteful wine crate during holidays. Nothing illicit, just social courtesy. Lefebvre sends everything back, unopened, so Paul shifts strategies. He begins cleaning up certain areas of the city, publicly. funds repairs to a war memorial, helps a widows' association recover stolen pension funds. His name begins appearing in local papers, always in the context of civic generosity. And Lefebvre? He now faces an odd dilemma. The man he suspects of running Marseille's underworld is also the one improving its schools and lowering street violence. Many people still think that Carbone didn't bribe Lefebvre with cash, but with confusion. So what do you think? By late 1927, the tension breaks, not with a bang, but with bureaucracy. Lefebvre is transferred to a sleepy post in Normandy. Officially, it's a promotion. Unofficially, it's exile. Paul doesn't celebrate. He simply resumes business. As usual, around this time, the Carbone Spirito enterprise begins specializing in a new commodity: stolen passports and identity papers. Europe is shifting, borders tightening, and desperate people, refugees, blacklisted intellectuals, fugitives, are willing to pay obscene amounts for new names. Paul's crew starts forging documents with such precision that even embassy staff are fooled. A girl from Warsaw becomes a dancer from Lyon. A fugitive banker from Belgium becomes a Greek tourist. One story whispers of a man who used Paul's papers to flee to Argentina, only to return years later, rich and grateful, donating half his fortune to a foundation Paul created under a priest's name. And so the lines between crime, charity, and cleverness keep blurring. Not everyone approves, of course. A rival gang operating out of Lyon begins interfering with Carbone's routes. Shipments disappear, couriers vanish. A nightclub in Marseille is firebombed. Spirito wants war. Paul wants patience. For weeks, he does nothing. Observes. Watches which names turn up too frequently in police chatter. Then one morning, a warehouse in Lyon explodes. No bodies are found, just ashes and silence. The attacks stop. Paul never comments on the incident. But that week, he's seen at a charity luncheon, sipping soup next to a senator's wife. He's becoming not just untouchable, but essential. He begins investing in real estate, quietly, under shell companies. Buys up half-empty buildings near the port, turns them into storage spaces or cultural centers. In reality, they serve as transaction hubs, holding cells, or temporary lounges for clients who need discretion more than luxury. One building is rumored to have a basement so deep it connects to the old sewer tunnels beneath the city. No one can confirm it. No one really wants to try. And through it all, Paul remains the same. Measured voice, unwrinkled suits, a faint scent of sandalwood and gunpowder. He walks through crowded streets, and the noise parts around him like a curtain. Children nod to him. Old men tip their hats. Even the pigeons seem to flutter a bit quieter when he passes. There's one story, a true one, that he once paid for the burial of a dock worker who died on the job. No one claimed the body, no family, no friends. Paul saw the man's name in a police report and paid for everything: coffin, priest, a modest grave with a marble headstone. Just a name, no dates. When asked why, he simply said, "A man should be remembered even if only once." That's the thing about Paul Carbone. For a man so steeped in crime, he moves like someone who believes in legacy, not in headlines, but in echoes. The 1920s slip into the 1930s with the quiet dread of a storm forming just offshore. But in Marseille, Paul Carbone watches the world tilt from the vantage of a man who has already planned his moves 6 steps ahead. Economic depression hits France like a brick. But for Paul, hard times are business opportunities dressed in rags. The working class suffers, prices spike, and jobs evaporate. But Paul's network grows stronger, leaner, more disciplined. When the government fails to feed its people, Paul's men show up with bread. When factories lay off workers, His clubs offer security jobs that come with a gun and a purpose. He doesn't advertise. He just waits. Desperation always finds its way to him. Spirito, meanwhile, tightens the muscle. The enforcers become more formal, structured like a private army. They wear suits now. They train with knives. They speak less. Paul insists on it. It's not fear that keeps people loyal, he says one night over red wine and lamp smoke. It's precision. This is also when they begin importing women in larger numbers, some willing, most deceived. Eastern Europe is fractured. Poverty runs deep in places like Warsaw, Belgrade, and Sofia. Paul sends recruiters, well-dressed men and soft-spoken women, offering jobs in France as dancers, maids, nurses. The girls arrive. Most don't speak French. Many never see a stage. They're funneled into brothels owned by shell companies tied to Carbone's network. It's horrible. It's criminal. And it's astonishingly profitable. Paul doesn't see faces anymore. Just efficiency. It's Spirito who handles the girls directly, keeps them in line, occasionally punishes those who resist. Paul keeps distance, always. One brothel, located on Rue de la Joliette, becomes infamous among dock workers and officials alike. Locals call it La Maison de Brume, the House of Mists, because the girls there, it's said, always seem to disappear into the fog of dawn. And yet, no arrests, no inquiries, no articles. Why? Because Paul owns more than the police. He owns the silence. In 1931, a major French newspaper plans to publish an exposé on Marseille's trafficking routes. The journalist, a young idealist from Paris, interviews a few former girls, now working as maids in Lyon under assumed names. He tracks financial records. He even shadows a known courier. His notes are detailed, meticulous. 3 days before publication, the newspaper's editor receives a visit. Not from a thug, from a lawyer. The man brings documents, bank statements, letters, not threats, but suggestions. If the paper wants to avoid being sued for libel, it must reconsider its story. The article never runs. The journalist leaves France for Canada. Some say he was paid off. Others whisper he saw something that made staying impossible. Many people still think he knew more than he ever printed. So what do you think? Paul doesn't comment on the affair. Instead, he funds a new school library in the 2nd arrondissement and is photographed with school children holding dictionaries. He smiles because it always works. That same year, Paul makes a bold move. He begins directly purchasing influence in Paris. Not just politicians, but media owners, shipping magnates, even one well-known opera singer who happens to have compromising photos with 3 cabinet members. The opera singer never speaks publicly again, but she performs at Paul's private birthday in 1932. Twice, Spirito, ever the realist, worries that Paul is becoming too public, too polished. But Paul shakes his head. The more I smile, he says, the harder it is for them to imagine I bite. They expand operations into North Africa again, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. This time, not as foot soldiers, but as suppliers. Opium from the east begins arriving via Ottoman contacts and colonial smuggling rings. Paul oversees the logistics like a general mapping terrain. He's obsessed with detail. One warehouse in Tunis becomes legendary among smugglers. It looks like a textile depot, smells like linen, and hides more morphine than any hospital in France. Shipments pass through Marseille in diplomatic crates, sometimes escorted by men in borrowed uniforms. Paul even secures temporary shipping licenses under fake non-profit names. One of them, hilariously, is called Les Enfants de la Mer, the Children of the Sea, a charity that technically does not exist, but appears on 3 government tax rolls. In 1933, Marseille holds a public vote on infrastructure improvements. Paul anonymously funds posters advocating for dock renovations. His name never appears, but his men count the votes. The measure passes. The docks are rebuilt. The smuggling gets easier. It's around this time that Paul buys a small vineyard outside Aix-en-Provence. Not for wine. For weekends, he spends Sundays there, walking through the vines, sometimes hosting quiet lunches with foreign visitors, men who speak little French but carry large briefcases and call him Monsieur with too much reverence. One visitor, said to be an American, arrives in 1934 with a plan. He represents a private interest from Chicago and offers Paul a partnership, French heroin in exchange for U.S. market access. Paul listens, sips his wine, says nothing. The American leaves the next day. 2 weeks later, a different American arrives. Younger, nicer suit, smiles more, offers better terms. Paul agrees. And just like that, a transatlantic heroin route is born. Ships disguised as fruit traders begin making monthly trips. Inside crates marked oranges and dates, the drugs are hidden in sealed wax tablets. The couriers wear rosaries, travel in pairs, and carry letters signed by a fake archbishop. No one stops them, because who searches fruit from the church? By now, Paul is in his late 30s, but he looks older, lines forming like careful brush strokes on his face. His suits get darker, his eyes quieter, but his memory still perfect. One night, he sees a former associate across a restaurant, a man who once stole from him in Tunis. The man now works as a mid-level clerk in Marseille's shipping authority. Paul doesn't call for violence. He doesn't raise an eyebrow. He just smiles. 3 weeks later, that man is arrested for tax fraud. Nothing connected to Paul, not directly, but those close to the matter know. Silence is safer, and so Paul Carbone continues. Corsican mind, Marseille heart, continental reach. He doesn't run from attention anymore. He walks into it, then makes it kneel. In the spring of 1935, Paul Carbone stands at the edge of St. Charles Station, watching trains snake into Marseille like arteries bringing lifeblood, or heroin, depending on the day. The station is loud, full of soldiers on leave, lovers and long goodbyes, and travelers dragging suitcases, stuffed with dreams or dirty money. Paul blends in. That's the trick. Always blend in, even while orchestrating the scene. St. Charles isn't just a station to him. It's a switchboard, a pulse point, a chessboard with carriages. Every arriving train brings opportunity. A diplomat's briefcase, a nervous courier, a box of religious texts with opium sealed between the pages. Carbone's men are everywhere here. Porters, ticket clerks, luggage handlers. Each of them plays a part in the smooth flow of illegal cargo under the nose of France's transportation ministry. And it's not just drugs anymore. Jewelry, stolen art, counterfeit currency. Whatever can be moved, Paul finds a place for it. The trick isn't hiding the crime. It's dressing it in routine. On Mondays, a train from Geneva brings uncut stones sewn into teddy bears. Tuesdays, a train from Naples arrives with crates of garlic, one of which always includes a ledger bound in pigskin, noting bribes owed and paid across 3 countries. Spirito oversees the more volatile logistics, lurking behind the warehouse walls, cracking jokes as he directs crates with the flick of a cigarette. But Paul walks through the station openly, a folded newspaper under one arm, tipping his hat to old women and buying espresso from the same vendor every morning. It's in these details that he controls perception. To the casual eye, he's just another Marseille businessman who smells faintly of bay rum and burnt tobacco. But the station staff know better. When Paul is present, even the clocks seem to tick more carefully. That year, a small-time smuggler named Lucian makes a fatal mistake. He reroutes a crate of opium meant for Paris to the wrong buyer in Lyon. Paul doesn't punish him, not directly. Instead, Lucian's cafe is bought, torn down, and replaced with a flower shop. Lucian disappears shortly after. Some say he left for Morocco. Others whisper he's buried beneath the lilies he once sold. And just like that, order is restored. St. Charles becomes more than a station. It becomes Carbone's theater. Inspectors take long lunches. Porters receive bonuses that arrive in crisp envelopes. Even the janitors are known to miss certain areas when sweeping. But it's not just corruption, it's coordination, precision. Paul begins referring to his operation as La Mécanique, the machine. He even brings in a retired rail engineer to redesign crate loading systems. The man, grateful for the work, never realizes he's optimizing drug smuggling. To him, it's just a logistics challenge. And Paul? He watches from his usual cafe perch, nodding approvingly as another shipment slips through customs like fog through a window crack. At night, the city pulses around the station. Shadowy figures come and go. Taxis idle too long. Women in long coats linger under the arches, eyes alert. And in the center of it all, the trains keep moving. They never stop. Neither does Paul, but beyond the station, things begin to change. A rival network begins sniffing around the edges of his operation. Not local thugs, foreign interests. A Sicilian crew linked to New York. They want in, or rather, they want to replace. Paul receives word of a meeting. Neutral ground, a cafe in Nice. The emissary from the Sicilian side arrives in a white suit, too clean for that town. He speaks in metaphors. The tide is shifting, he says. Many hands make lighter work. Paul smiles, finishes his drink, and replies, yes, but many hands also drop the vase. The meeting ends politely. But within a week, a boat carrying 3 of the Sicilian's men is discovered drifting in the harbor. Empty, except for their shoes, lined neatly on the deck. The message is clear. Marseille is not open for acquisition. And yet, Paul knows he can't fight the tide forever. The world is shrinking. The Americans are getting smarter. The French police, pressured by shifting governments and international press, begin asking more questions. Inspectors, once loyal, begin stalling. One even dares to ask Paul directly, is there any part of this city you don't own? Paul's answer is short. Just the church bells, monsieur, and they don't ring for me yet. Many people still think that was the moment Paul began considering a transition, from direct crime to something more protected. So what do you think? Around this time, Paul becomes more interested in legitimate fronts. He invests in shipping companies, art galleries, even a small film production house in Lyon. The productions aren't profitable, but they're useful. Actors make good couriers. Film reels, even better. He also begins donating more publicly. A hospital ward here, a children's theater there. He's even invited to a business conference in Switzerland, where he delivers a talk on emerging logistics pathways in Southern Europe. The irony is exquisite, but all this charm is only surface polish. Behind the scenes, Paul still keeps a small room, windowless, soundproofed, furnished with just 2 chairs and a table. He doesn't visit it often, but when someone needs convincing, that room speaks fluently in the language of compliance. Spirito, of course, never abandons the old methods. He prefers shadows, prefers blood. The 2 men never argue, but their methods drift further apart. There's a moment, one that many close to them recall, when Spirito lights a cigarette during a quiet night and says, "You're starting to act like a mayor," Paul replies. "I'd rather be the mayor than the mortician." And maybe that's it. Maybe Paul sees the writing on the station walls. He knows that power gained in darkness must, eventually, learn to walk in daylight, or risk being buried in it. Still, for now, the trains run on time. The station purrs, and the city sleeps, unaware that one Corsican man runs it all from a table near track 4, sipping espresso and memorizing timetables like sacred texts. By the time the Mediterranean heat settles over Marseille in the summer of 1936, Paul Carbone's world has become a strange symphony. Each note timed, each movement precise, every silence heavy with meaning. But for all the control he exerts, the city around him continues to evolve in ways that even he cannot always predict. His empire hums, but the tempo is changing. Politics stir uneasily. France is shifting. The Popular Front, with its promises of workers' rights and social reforms, sweeps into power. Strikes paralyze shipping routes. Newspapers shout slogans about liberty and equality. But Paul knows better than to fear slogans. He's survived more dangerous winds than these. Still, the strikes hit his network. Dock workers walk out. Trains stall. Even brothels lose staff, many of the women choosing solidarity over survival. For a moment, Paul contemplates using force. Spirito certainly favors it. But instead, Paul does what he's always done best. Adapts. He begins paying better. Not much, just enough to stay ahead of the rhetoric. He offers loans to union leaders, interest-free, on paper. In reality, it's influence repaid in favors. By the end of the summer, many of Marseille's most vocal agitators are quietly pocketing Carbone money. Some even come to him for advice. "If the people want bread," he tells one organizer, "you give them bread, then charge for the butter." At the same time, Paul deepens his operations in the Mediterranean. He opens new channels through Alexandria, taking advantage of Egypt's political instability. There, under the guise of shipping antiques and archaeological finds, he moves morphine in crates marked with hieroglyphs. Customs officers, uncertain of both the language and the law, rarely open them. He also returns briefly to Tunisia, not as a soldier this time, but as a businessman. The French colonial administration, ever hungry for order, welcomes him. He invests in warehouses, docks, and even a local soccer team. All of it serves the same purpose: logistics cloaked in legitimacy. While in Tunis, Paul reconnects with an old contact, Youssef, a former translator during his military days. Now a man with many passports and no fixed country. Youssef speaks 5 languages, drives like a devil, and has no family. The perfect courier. Youssef begins running a circuit from Tunis to Marseille, carrying information in code, often sewn into his jackets, sometimes tattooed in invisible ink on his forearm. One time, he smuggles a rolled map in the hollow of a violin. Another time, it's a single playing card with microscopic writing between the fibers. Paul doesn't ask how he does it. He just nods when Youssef appears, orders him coffee, and slides the next destination across the table. But not all innovations are foreign. Back in Marseille, Paul turns his attention to the one arena that has long resisted his touch: the press. Up until now, he's merely bribed editors, but bribery is fickle. What he wants is ownership. He begins quietly buying shares in a struggling local newspaper, then another, then a printing house. Within a year, Carbone controls the ink that prints the news. Not all of it, but enough. He doesn't censor, he steers. Stories about police raids are buried. Articles about heroic businessmen rebuilding post-war Marseille are placed front and center. He even ensures a flattering profile of himself runs in a Sunday edition, complete with an airbrushed photo and an exaggerated account of his wartime service. The caption under the photo reads, "Paul Carbone, from Corsican roots to civic giant." He cuts it out and keeps it. When Spirito sees the piece, he grunts, "Should have included your favorite soup recipe." Paul just smiles. But this era of subtlety is disrupted by an event no amount of spin can ignore. Late one September night, one of Paul's supply depots near the harbor erupts into flame. Not an accident. Arson. Firefighters arrive too late. The goods, worth hundreds of thousands in today's money, are lost. And worse, 3 of Paul's men are missing. A message then. But from whom? Some suspect Italian interests, others whisper of an internal betrayal. Even Spirito, for once, is silent. Paul doesn't retaliate, not immediately. Instead, he hosts a gala, yes, a gala, at one of Marseille's oldest theaters, freshly renovated by a shell company he owns. Paul invites dignitaries, artists, business owners, and even rival gang figures. It's opulence done in whisper tones, string quartets, champagne, no speeches. But the seating is no accident. Enemies find themselves seated beside magistrates. Journalists share drinks with smugglers. Everyone sees who holds the threads. At midnight, Paul steps onto the stage, not for a toast, but for a simple statement. In this city, even fire cannot erase what's written in stone. The room applauds, and no one mentions the warehouse again. Within a week, the presumed arsonist, an ex-employee with debts to a rival, is found floating near the docks. His hands are folded across his chest. No signs of violence, just a single coin placed on each eyelid. A Corsican tradition. The message is clear. Paul may be civil, cultured, and calculating, but he has not forgotten who he is. Around this time, historians note a shift in his demeanor. He speaks less, delegates more. His empire is vast now, too vast for one man to manage fully. But Paul still insists on certain rituals, inspecting warehouses himself once a month, interviewing new hires personally, walking the docks at dawn. One chilly morning, a dock worker asks him why he keeps doing that. Paul replies, "Because when the ground shifts, the first cracks appear under your feet, not in your office." Many people still think that's what made him different. He never trusted distance. So what do you think? But even as Paul watches the streets like a hawk, something else stirs. Something slower, subtler. He begins walking with a slight limp. He winces when lifting crates. And one night, during a private dinner, he drops a wine glass. Not because he's drunk, but because his hand doesn't respond. Spirito notices, says nothing, but Paul knows. The machine is still running, but one of its gears is wearing down. And Paul Carbone, for the first time, begins to wonder what a life after Marseille might look like. By early 1937, Paul Carbone is still Marseille's quiet architect, but something in him has softened, ever so slightly, like metal kissed by heat. The limp grows more pronounced, his silences longer, and though the empire hums as efficiently as ever, a curious tension begins to press at its edges. Power, it seems, is easy to build and harder to wear. Paul doesn't complain. He simply adjusts. Where once he walked the entire port each morning, now he rides in a sleek black Peugeot with smoked windows. Where he once spent hours at nightclubs managing talent, now he makes appearances, offers nods, and leaves before the last bottle is uncorked. People begin to murmur, quietly, that age is catching him, but no one dares say it within his earshot. To distract from these whispers, Paul embraces spectacle. The International Exposition is coming to Paris in 1937, a grand fair meant to celebrate art, science, and industry. France's political elite see it as a chance to restore the country's prestige. Paul sees it as something far more valuable: cover. He finances a pavilion, not directly, his name never touches a contract, but through a cultural association promoting Corsican heritage and artisanal trade. The booth sells lace, cured meats, and carved wooden trinkets. But behind the velvet partitions, Paul's couriers pass encrypted messages, route deals, and host meetings disguised as cultural demonstrations, and it works. Foreign dignitaries wander past, sampling Corsican honey while unknowingly brushing shoulders with some of Europe's most discreet criminals. Even American tourists stop by, snapping photographs of authentic Corsican craftsmanship, while just behind the curtain, heroin routes to New York are quietly being mapped. But Paul doesn't attend the exposition in person. Instead, he sends Spirito and a handful of trusted lieutenants. He prefers to stay in Marseille, where he feels the city pulse beneath his feet, like a conductor sensing a key shift before the first violinist even lifts his bow. Back home, he begins tightening his grip. He pushes deeper into media, buys a failing theater company, then uses its performers as distraction at high-level meetings. He starts appearing in newspapers more often, always in the background, always in charity events or cultural openings. In one photo, he's seen cutting a ribbon beside a cardinal and the mayor, smiling modestly in a light gray suit. The caption reads, "Businessman Paul Carbone supports restoration of historic district." No mention of the money laundering routed through the construction firm he used to fund the restoration. Of course not, but something else shifts that year. Something deeper than politics or bruised joints. One of his oldest couriers, René, is arrested in Lyon. Not for smuggling, but for murder. He'd stabbed a rival over a gambling dispute. Nothing to do with Paul. But René talks, not names, not directly, just enough. The arrest ripples. Paul doesn't panic, but his eyes change. He calls in favors from judges, offers compensation to the victim's family, and arranges for René's transfer to a low-security prison near Toulon. 2 weeks later, René hangs himself in his cell. At least that's what the report says. Spirito doesn't ask, neither does Paul. Instead, he hosts a wake. Small, somber, attended by men in coats too heavy for the weather. No priest, no flowers, just a bottle passed around in silence. That night, Paul walks alone along the Quai de Rive-Neuve, the wind off the harbor stinging his face. He pauses at a railing, looking out toward the sea, and he says quietly to no one, "There's too much memory in this city." From that moment, he begins preparing. He reorganizes his ledgers, moves assets offshore, closes accounts in Paris, opens new ones in Zurich under code names drawn from childhood stories. His real estate holdings are reshuffled, properties signed over to shell companies, then sold back to others he secretly controls. To the public, it looks like a successful businessman consolidating, but to his closest allies, it's something else, a soft retreat. Still, he's not done yet. That spring, Paul hosts a gathering. Not a party, not a gala, just a gathering. 20 guests, all high-ranking associates. They meet at a villa just outside Marseille, far from the docks and noise. There are no speeches, just wine, food, music, and a long walk at dusk through an olive grove. During that walk, Paul speaks to each man privately. No witnesses, no recordings, just words exchanged beneath whispering trees. Many people still think that night was his farewell. So what do you think? Some of those men would later say he asked them to guard the silence. Others claimed he gave them instructions for what to do if he vanished. Whatever was said, things changed afterward. Operations became more discreet. Certain routes were decommissioned. Others were handed over to younger men with no idea who really owned the ships. And yet, Paul still smiles, still shows up for church, still tips beggars, still rides in that black Peugeot, nodding to dock workers who pretend not to see the man whose money built their homes. One evening, as he steps out of a theater, a small child runs up and tugs his sleeve. "Monsieur Carbone," the boy says, eyes wide, "is it true you own all the boats?" Paul kneels slowly, smiles faintly, and replies, "No, little one. The sea does. I just borrow the tide." The child laughs. The mother apologizes. Paul waves them off. And then he disappears into the night. Not gone, just quieter. But those close to him notice. Paul is shifting from man to myth, and the city still runs on the machine he built. As 1938 dawns, the clouds over Europe begin to swirl with something far darker than black market dealings or whispered betrayals. War isn't just coming, it's circling, patient and sure. But Marseille, nestled on the southern edge of France, tries to pretend it's just another year. Ships still pull into port, cafés still buzz with conversation, and the air still tastes of salt and secrets. But Paul Carbone knows better. The tide is shifting, and tides don't ask permission. At first glance, nothing seems to change. His network remains intact. The brothels operate. The couriers run their routes. The false invoices still slide through tax offices. But beneath the surface, Paul begins adjusting the screws. Not because he fears collapse, but because he anticipates transformation. War scrambles everything: borders, alliances, morality. And where others see chaos, Paul sees margin. He starts moving money out of France, into neutral territories, Switzerland, Monaco, even South America. Not in large sums, but in carefully carved streams, channeled through art deals, shipping consortia, and fake insurance policies. One such transfer involves a set of religious relics, allegedly from a ruined church in Corsica. Delicate, gold-trimmed objects that conveniently fit inside hollowed books. They're smuggled into Lisbon, then vanish into a private collection. The money reappears weeks later in Buenos Aires, feeding into a new shell company, La Lumière Maritime. He doesn't brag. He doesn't even discuss it with Spirito. But he's preparing for something larger than he lets on. Around this time, Paul begins purchasing intelligence. Not the kind printed in newspapers, but names, lists, movements. He pays handsomely for whispers about military contracts, dock schedules, and political shifts in Paris. He even sets up a listening post, disguised as a radio repair shop, on a side street near the old port. The man running it is a Polish exile with shaky hands and perfect memory. Every night, he transcribes frequencies, then burns the notes. Paul reads the transcripts every morning, folded neatly beside his espresso and bread. One morning in March, he pauses mid-sip and mutters, "It's going to be Germany." He isn't wrong, but before the tanks roll, Marseille continues pretending to dance. And Paul, he performs the role flawlessly. He begins hosting cultural salons in his home. Intellectuals, painters, clergy, and smugglers all in one room. Poetry readings and piano music float through the halls, while opium shipments are processed beneath the floorboards. One guest, a Swiss journalist, later writes, "It was like sipping champagne on the lip of a volcano. Carbone's smile always just wide enough to hide the fire beneath. Paul doesn't mind the attention. If anything, he cultivates it. As the national mood becomes grim, he plays the benevolent figure. He donates to hospitals, funds a wartime charity for displaced children, and even offers food vouchers through the Carbone Initiative for Maritime Families. All of it clean, legal, carefully positioned in the press. But the real moves are happening elsewhere. Paul begins collaborating with elements of the Italian underworld, not the flamboyant dons of Sicily, but the quieter industrialists of Genoa, men who smuggle arms instead of heroin, who speak in numbers instead of threats. Through them, Paul establishes a new corridor, Trieste to Marseille, via rail and private courier. The goods? Morphine, yes, but also blueprints, forged documents, and most critically, transit papers for those fleeing rising fascism. It's this last move that surprises even Spirito. "Since when do you smuggle people out?" he asks over brandy one night. Paul doesn't answer directly, just stares at the fireplace and says, "Since the wrong ones started making lists." And indeed, the lists have begun. Jews, communists, exiles. Paul starts seeing names he recognizes, some of them former clients, some former enemies. He doesn't discriminate. He simply calculates risk versus reward. A family of 3, desperate to leave Paris, pays everything they own for passage to Algiers. Paul's men arrange false papers, stage an illness to justify travel, and deliver them to a freighter under cover of night. The family survives. They write letters for years. Paul never reads them. It's not sentiment, it's infrastructure. But not every operation runs smoothly. In late summer, one of Paul's smaller warehouses is raided. Not by police, but by a rival crew emboldened by the shifting political winds. They seize crates, beat 2 of Paul's men, and leave behind a single calling card. A white lily, wilted and stained with blood. It's symbolic, petty. Spirito wants to retaliate. Paul doesn't. Not yet. Instead, he visits the dockside bar where the raid was planned. Alone, he orders a drink, sits quietly, and when the bartender, nervous and twitching, tries to apologize, Paul interrupts. "Do you know what keeps this city running?" he asks softly. The bartender shakes his head. "It's not the money, not the goods. It's the silence, and you've made it noisy." That night, the bar burns to the ground. No bodies are found, but 3 men vanish. The docks go quiet again. Paul's message is clear. Order isn't optional, and still he prepares. He reassigns certain couriers to new routes, has double-blind drop points established across the southern countryside, farmhouses, vineyards, even old chapels. If France falls, he wants arteries in place, escape routes, resource caches, places to vanish. Many people still think Paul was preparing not just to survive war, but to survive any ending at all. So what do you think? By autumn, his health worsens. The limp sharpens. His left hand shakes when he writes. He stops signing documents directly, delegates that to a trusted lawyer. But his mind is as sharp as ever. Every morning, he memorizes 6 names: arrivals, departures, debts owed, loyalties tested. At a dinner with a government official, Paul is asked about the future. He replies, "Marseille is a ship. It doesn't sink. It just leaks differently depending on the storm, and the storm, at last, is visible on the horizon." Paul doesn't fear it. He sharpens his sails. Winter arrives early in Marseille in 1939. Cold seeps through shutters that never used to rattle, and the Mediterranean air, once fragrant with salt and spice, now carries something more metallic, like the taste of an old coin pressed against the tongue. War is no longer speculation. It is declaration. Germany marches. France holds its breath. And Paul Carbone, he keeps moving. The city reacts with confusion. Some shops shudder in panic. Others bloom with and hope by the handful. Meanwhile, Carbone's network tightens like a drawstring. His couriers no longer smile. His bookkeepers speak in code even over coffee. Everyone senses the weight of things to come. But Paul walks on, slow but composed, like a conductor waiting for the orchestra to catch up to his rhythm. Marseille, as always, remains both stage and sanctuary. Refugees stream into the port. Jews from Vienna, communists from Berlin, Spanish loyalists fleeing Franco. Some come with forged papers. Others arrive with nothing but silence in their pockets. Paul watches them, studies them, not with cruelty, with calculation. To Paul, people are movement, and movement means opportunity. He opens new routes, this time southward. Ships begin departing for North Africa more frequently. The manifests are always official: textiles, grain, medical supplies, but hidden within are people, some in crates, some in cargo holds disguised as staff, some with real passports, carefully altered, of course. He doesn't do this for charity. He does it for leverage, because every life he saves now becomes a debt he can collect later, in Cairo, in Casablanca, in whatever shape the world chooses after the war tears through its skin. One particularly dangerous operation involves a Hungarian chemist fleeing Nazi pursuit. He's hidden in the hull of a fishing boat, wedged between false walls with just a flask of water and a book of psalms in German. Paul not only arranges his escape, but later funds the man's research in Tunis. Years later, that chemist would develop a process for synthetic opiates that revolutionizes underground markets. Paul never lives to see it, but the credit etched into ledger margins. H, it says. Just H. Back in Marseille, things grow more delicate. The French government, scrambling for unity, begins cracking down on organized crime. But organized is a generous word. Most outfits fracture under pressure. Paul's, however, contracts without breaking. He calls it the turtle phase, when you pull everything inward and wait for the hammer to glance off your shell. One day in January, a police inspector visits Paul's residence. Not raiding, visiting. He's offered espresso and a seat. The inspector, a tired man with gray in his hair and a war medal tucked under his coat, simply says, "There are eyes on you, not just ours. Eyes from Paris. Eyes from Berlin." Paul listens, nods once, then says, "If they're watching me, then they're not watching the ones who should worry." The inspector leaves with a bottle of wine he didn't ask for. A week later, that inspector is reassigned to Vichy. Paul starts preparing fallback plans. He sends Spirito to Algiers, unofficially. Not a retreat, just a displacement. Keep things warm, Paul says. Spirito doesn't argue, but before leaving, he stares at Paul for a long minute. "You're thinking of staying," he says. Paul nods. Spirito spits, not in disgust, but in frustration. "You and this damned city." To Paul, it's not sentiment, it's geometry. "I know its corners," he says. "Where they echo, where they don't." Marseille's geography has always been part of his power. The city bends around him like an old coat. Even in wartime, it doesn't betray him. It conceals. It cooperates, but danger arrives anyway. A Gestapo delegation visits the city in February, under diplomatic pretense. Paul receives word from a dock worker before the ship even docks. The names are known: Reinhardt, Kessler, Voigt. Men who don't visit ports without a list of objectives and a pocket full of orders. Paul doesn't wait. He arranges a dinner. Yes, a dinner. A quiet, candlelit affair at a hotel overlooking the port. He invites 2 Vichy officials, a local bishop, and one art collector with known ties to the Germans. Then, through the collector, he arranges for the Gestapo men to be accidentally invited. The meeting is surreal. Polite conversation. Veiled questions. Paul, in a charcoal gray suit, answering everything with the warmth of someone who has nothing to hide and the grace of someone who's hidden everything. One of the officers, Kessler, makes a remark about undesirable elements moving through the port. Paul lifts his glass, smiles faintly, and says, "Yes, tides are difficult to police, but I find that they can be redirected." Kessler smirks, says nothing more. The dinner ends in handshakes, and by morning, Paul knows that a temporary alliance has been struck. Not a partnership, not trust, just a mutual understanding between men who know that survival sometimes speaks German. That week, Carbone's operation tightens again. No more visible gatherings. Routes are staggered. Codes changed. Dead drops moved to new districts. Even his home becomes quieter. Servants are let go. Curtains stay drawn. He begins walking at night again, despite the limp. It's the only time he feels clear. The city, when asleep, still sings the old melody. Stone against sea, wind against shutter, memory against silence. One night, he visits an old café he hasn't seen in years. The owner is gone. The chair's different. But the smell, the blend of roasted chicory and dust, is exactly the same. He sits alone, orders nothing, just listens. Later, a server asks if he needs anything. Paul replies, "No, just wanted to remember something without remembering why." And he leaves. Many people still think that was the last time he ever went out without protection. So, what do you think? Back at headquarters, though no one calls it that anymore, he lays out a map, not of Marseille, of post-war Europe, circles cities, underlines names, scribbles cryptic notes in a blue pen that only he uses. To an outsider, it's chaos. To Paul, it's a calendar, because he knows the war won't last forever. But legacy? Legacy outlives the noise. The spring of 1940 brings with it a brutal clarity. France falls, quickly, messily, almost with embarrassment. German boots march across the countryside, while the government fractures into two faces, resistance and collaboration. Marseille, that sultry, sea-drenched jewel of the South, finds itself in the strange twilight of Vichy rule. Technically French, but thick with German whispers. Paul Carbone sees it all unfold from his usual table near the harbor, a place where pigeons still coo and the coffee remains terrible. And yet, the world is now different. Streets once humming with vendors and laughter now tremble with quiet fear. People speak softer. Doors close earlier. Shadows deepen. But Paul, he doesn't retreat. He pivots, because to him, war is not disruption. It's reorganization. And in reorganization, there is margin. He begins cultivating Vichy connections. Carefully. No declarations. No uniforms. Just meetings over wine and whispered assurances. He's no Nazi sympathizer. Far from it. But he recognizes power when it takes up residence, and he understands how to breathe around it. One of his most useful new contacts is a mid-level Vichy transport official named Giraud, a bland man with impeccable shoes and an urgent need to be taken seriously. Paul invites him to dinner, flatters his insights, feigns interest in wartime efficiency, and by dessert, he secured clearance for 3 dockside warehouses to be declared strategically exempt. That one meal saves Paul's operation, because those warehouses now become sanctuaries, legal blind spots. One is used to funnel refugees out of the country. Another stores morphine in crates labeled textile adhesives. The third, a ghost site, empty on paper. A physical space used only for whispers and disappearances. Spirito returns from North Africa around this time. He's lost weight, gained new scars, and brings back rumors of German alliances forming with local thugs, of Spanish smugglers playing both sides, of people going missing without even a pause in the wind. He and Paul walk the harbor one night, boots clicking against stone. "This is bad," Spirito says. Paul nods quietly. "We're going to have to get blood on our hands." Paul stops, turns slowly. "We've always had blood on our hands. Now we just have to keep it from staining the floor." They don't speak for the rest of the walk. The city becomes tenser. Curfews are enforced. Identity checks multiply. People disappear. Some return with hollow eyes. Others don't return at all. And yet, Paul's organization thrives. Not because of cruelty, because of calibration. He doesn't resist the new order. He steers around it. In fact, many of his routes now serve dual functions. A truckload of flour for Marseille's bakeries also carries forged papers for 6 Jewish families. A fishing boat, officially registered to a Catholic charity, quietly ferries letters between resistance cells in Toulon and Nice. Paul charges for these services. Always. But fairly. He doesn't gouge the desperate. He doesn't weep either. He simply calculates. He also begins building favors that have nothing to do with money. One afternoon, a German officer's wife walks into one of Paul's nightclubs. She's lost, nervous, clearly out of place. Paul personally ensures she's escorted home safely. Days later, the officer, Major Beckman, invites Paul to lunch. They speak vaguely of business, logistics, dock timetables. But Beckman, a man not entirely blind to Marseille's undercurrent, eventually leans forward and says, "You are useful," Paul replies, "only to those who require less chaos." It's not a threat, not a boast, just a fact. After that meeting, Paul is left alone, not protected, not supported, just undisturbed. But it comes at a cost. Many people still think this was the moment Paul made a devil's bargain, to stay alive by staying still, even as others suffered. So what do you think? At night, he begins sleeping in different places. Never the same house 2 nights in a row. He keeps a go bag under his seat, a revolver in every property, 3 separate identities, all fully documented, all with exit strategies. He also creates a safe house system, 12 apartments across Marseille, each equipped with basic supplies, untraceable keys, and a tiny map hidden inside a bar of soap. It's Spirito who installs the false walls. It's Paul who memorizes which ones open to stairs and which open to silence. Still, even in this tightened, perilous city, Paul never loses his sense of theater. One night, he throws a dinner party in a cellar beneath a shuttered opera house. Candles light the stone arches. A violinist plays softly. The guests? 3 resistance funders, 1 Vichy informant, a Jewish antique dealer, and a German black market broker, all seated politely, sipping soup and pretending they don't recognize one another. Paul presides, serene as ever. They dine. No one dies. Not that night. One of the resistance men later describes the evening as the most peaceful moment I experienced in the whole war, and the most dangerous. But even the best performances can't erase the cracks forming. That autumn, one of Paul's key lieutenants, Benoit, is captured by the Gestapo. He survives interrogation, says nothing. But his arrest sends tremors through the organization. Paul immediately reassigns roles, changes courier patterns, burns entire contact books. For 3 days, the operation goes dark. Then it roars back to life, more cautious, more covert, more brutal. From that point on, Paul institutes a new policy. No one knows more than 3 names in their chain. Compartmentalization becomes gospel. Even Spirito is kept out of certain loops. Paul trusts no one completely, not even himself. He begins dictating letters in the early hours. Coded reflections, instructions, confessions. They're never sent, just stored in sealed envelopes marked with a single word: sigh. If the contents remain unknown, but he writes them religiously. Meanwhile, the city trembles on the edge. Every rumor becomes a weight. Every knock at the door, a test. Every street corner might hold a friend, or a vanishing. And Paul Carbone, the Corsican who once ruled Marseille with nothing more than timing and silence, now moves like a ghost wrapped in gray wool and exhaustion. Still alive, still feared, but something quieter now, something waiting. By the first frost of 1941, Marseille has become a city of locked doors and watching eyes. What once flowed in shadows now crawls under floorboards. The rhythms of street life, market chatter, accordion music, seagulls squabbling over stale bread, have thinned, replaced by the heavy footfalls of boots, both French and foreign. For most, it's a time to hide. For Paul Carbone, it's a time to refine. He begins to think of his network not as an empire, but as a clock. Ticking, delicate, intricate. Every cog must fit. Every movement must be clean. This isn't just about crime anymore. It's about preservation, of systems, of memory, of leverage. One system in particular draws his obsession: the southern railway lines. The trains that once brought opium and money now transport something else: desperation. Refugees crammed into cattle cars, soldiers repositioned under the guise of neutrality, contraband disguised as canned peaches. Paul knows the routes, knows the station masters, and more importantly, knows where the system leaks, so he begins to use it again. He revives the old St. Charles station circuits, tightened, sharpened, sterilized. Couriers now carry nothing by hand. Everything is concealed within false bottom crates, embedded in violin cases, hidden inside fuel barrels. One train even transports a small statue of St. Jude filled with diamonds and forged passports. Paul calls that operation the Pilgrim Job. No one gets caught. Still, the stakes are higher now. He watches his men more closely, double-checks reports, cross-references bribes. Anyone who deviates from routine is quietly dismissed or quietly disappears. Spirito notices. "You're not sleeping," he says one night, their silhouettes cast against the flickering light of a safe house. "I sleep fine," Paul replies, "just not for long." And he doesn't. 3 hours here, an hour there, always with his boots beside the bed, his coat laid across a chair, a pistol resting in the drawer with a rosary and a pen. But it's not fear that keeps him alert. It's the weight of orchestration. Too many moving parts, too many threads. And now, new pressures arrive from both sides. The Germans begin asking questions about Marseille's unregistered freight. A Vichy official, an old contact, suddenly disappears. A coded message arrives from Algiers. The smoke is watching the fire now. Paul knows what it means. Someone close has turned. He doesn't panic. He prunes. One courier is quietly strangled and left in a bathtub. Another is told to leave the country or leave the earth. A third simply vanishes. Her last known address abandoned except for a pack of cigarettes on the windowsill. Trust already rare becomes extinct. Paul institutes a rotating system of passwords, locations, even aliases. His men now speak in phrases like, "The dog limps at midnight," and 4 pairs for the bishop. It's theatrical, yes, but it works. Confusion, he's found, is sometimes more effective than loyalty. At the same time, he reinvents one of his oldest tricks, the charity front. He funds a new organization, Les Mains Claires, the clean hands. Publicly, it provides relief to war widows and orphans. Privately, it channels forged papers, safe passage, and ration cards to resistance contacts and persecuted families. Many of its volunteers are real. Many don't even know they're part of anything illegal, but the books balance. The names are safe, and the children eat. Still, not everyone believes in Paul's reformation. A resistance member, young, proud, principled, confronts him one night. They meet in a church courtyard, under rain that soaks through every coat and washes nothing clean. "You're a parasite," the boy says. "Now you pretend to be a savior." Paul doesn't argue. He lights a cigarette with fingers that don't shake. "I'm a clockmaker," he says. "I fix what ticks wrong. And sometimes the pendulum swings both ways." The boy spits at his feet. Paul steps around it. 2 weeks later, the boy's father is released from a prison transport. No name is given, just a nod. The boy never thanks him, but he never confronts him again. The war, meanwhile, continues to complicate the city's balance. Food becomes scarcer. Electricity falters. Even the black market feels squeezed. Prices soar. One loaf of bread costs the same as a pistol. One bottle of wine could buy a man's silence, or his body. Paul begins bartering more than buying. Information, access, security. These become his currencies. He once trades a bag of flour for the name of a collaborator in Lyon. Another time, he offers 3 gallons of fuel to secure the release of a Greek courier. That same courier would later carry 3 names sewn into the lining of his coat. Names that helped dismantle an arms network operating in Marseille under Gestapo oversight. Not all his choices are clean. He occasionally provides safe passage to people with bloodied pasts, former torturers, informants, even one SS officer posing as a diplomat. Paul doesn't care who they are. He cares what they pay and what he can learn, because every escape route he controls, every identity he sells, every secret he hears, it all builds something. A ledger not of money, but of leverage. One evening, Paul sits in his study, flipping through an address book. It's color-coded now. Red for enemies, blue for assets, green for those who've repaid their debts. There are few greens. He pauses on one name, draws a line through it. Doesn't explain why. Spirito walks in. "You ever think about Corsica?" Paul exhales slowly. "Every day," he says, "and then I remember why I left." "Why?" Paul doesn't answer, but later that night, he dreams of hills, of cracked stone walls and olive trees that sway like whispers. When he wakes, he writes 3 new names in the blue column, and for the first time in months, he doesn't lock the door behind him when he leaves the house. Many people still think that by this point, Paul Carbone wasn't just surviving the war. He was shaping its shadows. So what do you think? Summer 1941 creeps into Marseille like an uninvited guest. The heat presses down, not just on the rooftops and docks, but on the nerves of a city that has learned to flinch at the sound of distant boots. Fear simmers in the walls. The air tastes of dust and tension. But Paul Carbone doesn't slow. If anything, he begins moving with more precision, like a man who knows the orchestra is reaching its final crescendo. That's the thing with war. It reshapes loyalties the way fire reshapes metal, hardening some, melting others. Paul, ever the craftsman, takes note of every temperature shift. He doesn't rely on instinct. He relies on information. To that end, he expands his personal intelligence network, not just smugglers or informants, but clerks, janitors, waitresses. The people who sweep floors and pour drinks often hear more than generals. One such source is a young woman named Elise, who works in a Gestapo-controlled hotel near the port. She's polite, forgettable, and very good at looking like she's not listening. In truth, she memorizes entire conversations, sketches faces, and passes notes baked into loaves of bread. Paul pays her with ration stamps and protection. It's Elise who brings him the name of a Frenchman working both sides, feeding the Gestapo details about escape routes in exchange for safe passage for his family. Paul doesn't react immediately. He waits, watches, When the man is spotted following one of Paul's couriers, the decision is made. He vanishes. No one speaks of it. No one needs to. Meanwhile, Paul begins developing what he calls the double road. Every route out of the city now has a twin. One real, one decoy. Couriers are told only which train to take, never the final destination. Letters are divided into fragments and delivered by multiple people who never meet. Even the resistance starts using his system. Yes, the resistance. It surprises even Spirito, who finds out one evening after following a courier without Paul's knowledge. He returns angry, confused. "You're helping them now?" he asks. Paul shrugs. "I'm helping the side that understands how clocks work, but they don't pay." "No," Paul says, "but they remember," and he's right. One cell leader, codenamed Martin, sends Paul a gift, a locket with a photo of a girl he helped escape. Inside the locket is a microfilm with maps of German checkpoints. Paul never wears it, but he keeps it in a drawer beside a pistol and an old Corsican coin. His past, his present, his insurance. Despite the constant danger, Paul maintains appearances. He still walks certain streets, still tips the baker's boy, still visits the same cafe, always ordering the same bitter coffee, which he drinks slowly, staring into middle distance like a man searching for a memory he once buried on purpose. But his public face hides a deepening exhaustion. The limp is worse. The tremor in his left hand no longer subtle. He no longer signs documents. He uses a seal. His voice is quieter now, but somehow heavier. Like every word weighs more because there are fewer of them left to give. One night, as a favor, he visits an old friend, an apothecary who once smuggled heroin in religious candles and now treats Paul's failing body with quiet dignity. "You need rest," the man says. Paul replies, "When it's safe." "It will never be safe," the man whispers. Paul doesn't answer. He knows, and yet the machinery keeps moving. By late July, Paul orchestrates one of his most daring operations, a fake diplomatic convoy traveling from Marseille to Geneva. Officially, it carries humanitarian aid for prisoners of war. Unofficially, it carries 6 people with false papers, 3 crates of cash, and a set of documents detailing German supply routes in North Africa. Everything about it is risky. The uniforms are real, stolen from a Vichy depot. The vehicles are real, borrowed under forged requisition orders. The route is patrolled, timed, calculated to the minute. It works, and just like that, 6 lives are saved. Thousands of francs are repositioned, and the resistance gains tactical maps that will alter the course of supply lines in Tunisia. No one claps, no one celebrates, but Paul receives a handwritten note 3 weeks later. "The sand has shifted. We have you to thank." It's unsigned. The ink smells of jasmine. He folds it carefully, places it in the same drawer as the locket, the coin, and now a second pistol. Clean, oiled, never used. Still, the success doesn't lift the weight. A month later, another warehouse is raided. 3 men are arrested. 1 is tortured. The other 2 talk. Paul learns this before the papers do. Within 48 hours, the 2 men are found in a dry well near Cassis, their mouths sewn shut with fishing line. A message, not to the Germans, to the rest of his organization. The machinery may slow, but it will not slip. And yet, he feels it. The thinning of time, the narrowing of paths. One night, while sitting on the rooftop of a safe house overlooking the port, he turns to Spirito and says, "Do you ever think about how many lives we crossed?" Spirito exhales. "I try not to." Paul nods. "Me neither," he says, "but they cross me anyway, and they do." Faces he helped, faces he harmed. The boy in Corsica with the empty stomach, the girl with diamonds in her shoe soles, the officer who took his bribe and later shot his own cousin to keep the secret safe. Many people still think that by 1941, Paul Carbone had begun preparing for his own disappearance. Not a retreat, not a surrender, just a subtraction. So what do you think? One last favor, one last ledger. Then, maybe sleep. Maybe something quieter than the city ever allowed. Autumn in Marseille arrives like a sigh through a cracked window. Cool, damp, and quiet in a way that unnerves more than it comforts. The city moves slower now. The war has aged it. Its children speak in hushed tones. Its alleys feel tighter, as if the stone walls themselves have begun to flinch. But Paul Carbone still moves with purpose. Even if the steps are fewer, the breaths more measured, and the days more calculated, he begins trimming excess from the network, not out of fear, but out of design. He calls it consolidation. Others call it something closer to prophecy. The man who once ran Marseille like a private theater now retreats behind the curtains. Not to hide, to watch. He sells 2 nightclubs, transfers 3 warehouses to foreign shell companies, reassigns routes, and he begins writing, longhand on yellowed paper, always with the same blue pen, always in the same room, lit by a single bulb. He doesn't say what the pages are for. A memoir? A map? Instructions? No one knows. Not even Spirito. When asked, Paul simply replies, "There are some things I don't want to explain twice." At the same time, he becomes more generous. He starts delivering ration packages to orphanages, quietly pays the back taxes of small businesses on the brink. He visits a retirement home in Montolivet and funds a kitchen renovation. No press, no plaques, just envelopes delivered and smiles never returned. But it isn't repentance, it's balance. Because behind these acts of mercy, the machine still grinds. Couriers still vanish. Shipments still flow. And the rumors, always the rumors, grow louder when whispers that Paul is dying. Another claims he's leaving for South America. A third says he's already gone. And the man in the city is an actor, a decoy, a ghost. Paul hears them all and smiles. Then, in November, something strange happens. A German officer is found dead in a hotel near the port, strangled. No signs of struggle, no missing items. Just a deck of cards on the bedside table. Ace of spades on top. Within hours, the city panics. Gestapo officers comb the streets. Curfews are tightened. Raids increase. The resistance doesn't claim the hit. Neither does any rival faction. The tension nearly breaks something fragile in the air, and then Paul receives a note. No envelope, just folded paper slipped under his door. It reads, "Balance returned. We keep our promise. You keep your silence." No signature. Paul burns it in a dish by his bedside and tightens his coat, because even he isn't sure who's keeping score anymore. Meanwhile, his relationship with Spirito begins to shift. The bond remains, but the tone darkens. They argue more, quietly, sharply. One evening, over wine and roast chicken in a shuttered apartment above a bakery, Spirito slams his glass down. "You're ending things," he says. Paul nods. "Why?" Paul shrugs. "Because everything good gets quiet before it ends." That's not an answer. "It's the only one I have." Spirito storms out. That night, Paul adds another name to the red column in his ledger, but it's not Spirito. It's his own. Still, he doesn't disappear. Not yet. Instead, he begins preparing the signal. A quiet system of symbols to alert the rest of his network if things ever collapse. 3 lanterns in a certain window. Evacuate. A black coat hung from a 3rd-floor balcony. Bury all records. A bird cage left open on a cafe table. Safe house compromised. These symbols begin appearing in odd places around the city, but only a few know what they mean. Most assume it's urban decay. Others suspect superstition. But to Paul's men, it's gospel. Then, one cold morning, Elise, the hotel informant, appears at Paul's door. her face pale and blood dried into her collar. She's been followed. She's been interrogated. She didn't break, but they know her name now. Paul doesn't panic. He walks her to a safe house near the old quarter, where a priest, real or not, offers her a new identity and a train ticket to Lisbon. She weeps when she thanks him. He only says, "Use a different name this time." Then he walks back to his office. That afternoon, he gets word. The Gestapo has compiled a list. 200 names. Resistance, black market, collaborators, couriers, unknowns. His name is on it. Number 13. He doesn't flinch. Instead, he hosts a final meeting. Not in a hidden cellar, not behind curtains, but at a public restaurant in the heart of Marseille. Middle of the lunch hour. No disguises. No codes. Just Paul, Spirito, 2 lieutenants, and a 5th man no one recognizes. They speak in normal tones. They eat roasted lamb and drink watered wine. Paul passes a folder across the table. The 5th man nods, folds it, and leaves. No one follows him. After the meal, Paul lights a cigarette. The tremor in his hand is slight, but visible. "This is the last one," he says. No one argues. Later, one of the waiters finds an envelope under the table. Inside are 2 things, a page torn from a ledger and a Corsican coin. The page lists 6 addresses, all now empty. Many people still think that this meeting marked the beginning of the end, not of Paul Carbone's life, but of his architecture. The city would go on, yes, but without its clockmaker. So, what do you think? The final winter of Paul Carbone's life begins not with snow, but with silence. Marseille, by January 1942, no longer breathes. It holds its breath. German occupation tightens around Vichy's soft underbelly, and rumors spread faster than bread. Fear becomes a second currency, traded in glances and hesitations, in the refusal to ask too many questions. And yet, Paul continues moving, not because he's blind to the danger, because he has always known that death, like politics, prefers appointments to surprises. He keeps to a reduced circle now. 4 men, 2 women, no outsiders. Meetings happen in moving cars, on rooftops, behind church pulpits. His ledger shrinks, not out of disinterest, because fewer names are worth writing. He no longer walks the harbor, no longer visits cafés, but people still see him, in windows, in reflections, at the edge of alleyways, always observing, always listening. Some say he sleeps standing up now, like a horse. Others claim he hasn't slept at all. The truth is quieter than that. He sleeps, but each time he dreams of the sea, not the Marseille he built, but the Corsican coast he left behind. And for the first time, he doesn't dream of returning. He dreams of being forgotten. Meanwhile, the Germans grow bolder. They begin arresting collaborators. Not the real ones, of course, just the noisy ones. A theater owner, a fence, a clumsy forger who left ink smudges across his own fake papers. Paul notices the pattern. "They're not cleaning house," he mutters to Spirito one night. "They're thinning the brush." For what? To see the real trees, because Paul knows what's coming. The occupiers have learned. The loud criminals are distractions, but the silent ones, the architects, the Carbone types, they're what worry Berlin now, and it's only a matter of time. So Paul accelerates the wind down. He destroys half his own records. Not burns. He buries them, deep beneath a shuttered bakery once used to hide arms. He arranges the disappearance of 3 couriers, whose faces appeared in too many photographs. He fakes the deaths of 2 associates and sends them to South America under priestly aliases. He calls it clearing the table before the food goes bad, but others call it a farewell. Then comes the final job. A contact from the resistance, codenamed Le Verbe, approaches him with a request. A transport of explosives and radio equipment, to be moved through Marseille under the cover of Paul's supply routes. It's audacious, risky, almost suicidal. And Paul agrees, not because it's noble, Because it's clean, a bookend. He organizes the route himself. 3 trucks painted as Red Cross supply vehicles, 2 decoys, 1 real. The driver? A resistance fighter who once washed dishes in one of Paul's clubs. Everything is precise, but someone talks. Many people still think it was an old debt collector. Caught, flipped, desperate. So what do you think? The convoy is intercepted outside X. The real truck is seized. The driver is killed. But the Germans don't just arrest the crew. They come for Paul. On a gray February morning, 4 Gestapo men arrive at his residence. Quiet, clinical, eyes like dried paper. They don't shout. They don't break doors. They simply knock and wait. Paul answers, wearing his favorite overcoat and a scarf tucked neatly around his neck. He nods, as if greeting clients. They ask if he will come peacefully. He replies, "If I didn't want to, I wouldn't have opened the door." He is taken not to a prison, but to an administrative building, where he is interrogated for 7 hours. They ask about names, about addresses, about affiliations. He speaks little. When he does, it's with his usual detached calm. "Gentlemen," he says once, "if I'd kept records, I'd have died in 1932. They don't beat him. They don't need to. They release him after midnight." The next day, word spreads across the city. Paul Carbone has returned home, but the air is different now. He doesn't walk like a man returning. He walks like someone counting backward. Spirito visits. "You're finished," he says. Paul doesn't argue. He just lights a cigarette and replies, "We always were. You just hear it now." Over the next 2 weeks, Paul closes accounts, gives away some money. Not much. Just enough to confuse people. He mails a small box to an old friend in Tunis. Inside, a coin, a silver watch, and a map with one route circled in red. He calls no one else. Then, on March 16th, 1943, Paul Carbone is killed in a railway accident just outside Marseille. That's the official report. Some say it was sabotage. Others say it was staged. Some swear they saw him weeks later in Tangier, sipping espresso beside a woman with ash blonde hair and a pistol in her purse. Many people still think he never boarded that train at all. So what do you think? The funeral is small. No police. No speeches. Just rain. Spirito stands at the edge of the grave, coat soaked through, not blinking once. When someone offers him an umbrella, he says he wouldn't have liked it, and walks away. Marseille keeps breathing. The docks stay busy. The networks shift. The names change. But certain back rooms remain untouched. Certain ledgers remain blank. And on the St. Charles platform, beneath a rusted pipe, there's still an etching. Half worn, half forgotten. Just 3 letters. PC. Not a signature. A reminder. The city doesn't pause for grief. It never has. Even when legends vanish, Marseille continues. The ships dock, the waves slap against concrete walls, and someone somewhere still counts cash beneath flickering light. But after Paul Carbone's death, real or faked, the shadows shift. Spirito feels it first. He still walks the same streets, eats at the same cafés, smokes the same brand of cigarettes. But the looks are different now. Eyes slide past him instead of toward him. People nod with hesitation, not respect. Because without Paul, Spirito isn't the partner anymore. He's just what's left, and in what's left, there's silence. The old network doesn't collapse, not immediately, but it begins to thin, like smoke in a ventless room. Without Paul's precision, some routes double back on themselves. Some couriers drift to new loyalties. Some simply disappear. Spirito tries to hold it together. He's always been the muscle, the whisper behind the threat. But Paul was the hinge, the ledger, the restraint, and now the city waits to see what happens when the clock ticks without its watchmaker. There's a finality in the air. Not sudden, not loud, but like dusk. One of Paul's former accountants, a man who never liked sunlight and always wore gloves, visits Spirito with one last sealed envelope. "He gave it to me months ago," the man says. "Said I'd know when to deliver it." Spirito opens it alone. Inside is a single sheet of paper with Paul's neat blue pen. "You always knew how to finish a fight. I always hoped you'd learn when to leave one. Marseille was never ours. We just kept its ghosts fed. If they're still hungry, don't be the meal." Spirito reads it twice, then burns it. By April, the Germans begin losing their grip on the region. Resistant cells grow bolder. Bombs whisper in alleyways. Collaborators vanish. And in the midst of it, Paul's old empire is picked apart. Not by force, but by absence. One former smuggler is arrested for hoarding ration cards. A brothel burns down under suspicious circumstances. An associate in Lyon is gunned down outside a café. Slowly, the skeleton of Paul's world is exhumed and scattered, but not everything dies. Some safe houses remain untouched. A courier route through Nice continues uninterrupted. One accountant in Marseille continues to pay out small, unexplained pensions to 4 families under fictitious names. And under the floorboards of a forgotten storage room in the old port, a rusted tin box is found in 1946. Inside, a set of keys, a passport in the name of Jean Castan, and a note that reads simply, "If you found this, then I left well. Don't wait for me. Don't look for me. And don't believe everything you're told." It's unsigned. The passport photo is blurred with age. Was it him? Many people still think Paul Carbone escaped, slipping out of Marseille with a new name, new bones, new purpose. Some say he lived out his days in Casablanca, running a small casino. Others claim he joined the French resistance under another name and died anonymously in a trench outside Dijon. One wild rumor even places him in Argentina, teaching piano to a general's daughter. But truth folds, and the city forgets him slowly. Over time, new criminals rise, new alliances form, new wars begin. But in certain corners, the name Carbone still carries weight. Not like thunder, but like an old bruise. Something that doesn't hurt anymore, but never quite healed. And late at night, when the air is thick and the sea hums low, Marseille remembers. Not the man, the method, the order, the silence. The echoes of Paul Carbone's disappearance had not yet settled when Marseille's underworld shifted beneath its own weight. Without him at the helm, old alliances frayed like mooring ropes left in salt too long. But even as new players rose, louder, brasher, and more reckless, his influence remained in the quiet systems still operating beneath their noise. That was the brilliance of Carbone's design. His empire was not built on loyalty. It was built on inertia. Couriers still followed paths they no longer understood. Safe houses continued rotating occupants on schedules no one remembered establishing. Even cafe owners left envelopes at designated tables each Thursday, not knowing if anyone would ever collect them again. Spirito, for his part, maintained the illusion of control. He slipped into Paul's absence like a man putting on an old coat, familiar in weight, but tighter in the shoulders. He still commanded respect. But it was the brittle kind, the kind that cracks when tested, and tested they did. A new faction from Toulon, a rougher breed, born in war and weaned on desperation, moved in on one of Carbone's old docks. They didn't ask permission. They didn't offer tribute. They simply started showing up, unloading crates, bribing port guards with sloppier smiles and thicker envelopes. Spirito tried diplomacy. They laughed, so he returned to the only language he spoke fluently. One cold April night, 2 trucks arrived at the contested dock. Inside, 4 men with rope, lime, and no questions. By morning, the Toulon crew had vanished. Their crates, untouched, were left as if waiting for someone else to claim them. And no one did, because the city remembered. Paul may have vanished, but his rules remained. And one of those rules was carved into Marseille's ribcage. You may own the street, but you answer to the shadow. Still, shadow has its limits. The problem now was spiritual, symbolic. Carbone had not just been a leader. He had been a myth. Part smuggler, part civic saint, part whisper no one could trace. Without him, the underworld lacked its lodestar. And Spirito, while feared, lacked the poetry. Where Paul walked in calculated calm, Spirito walked like a blade looking for flesh. It worked for a while, but the war was shifting again. The Allies were pressing from North Africa. Resistance networks grew louder, bolder, and Marseille, still technically under Vichy control, was increasingly a city with no captain, no compass, just tides. In June, rumors began to swirl. A high-ranking Nazi officer wanted the Marseille docks cleaned of criminal interference. He had maps, names, files. Spirito heard it from 3 sources within a day. One name kept surfacing, Carbone. Paul's ghost was now being blamed for networks he no longer touched, routes he had long since burned. One Gestapo report referred to him as Le Maître Fantôme, the Ghost Master. It was, ironically, the most accurate title anyone had ever given him. And so, from exile or grave, Paul Carbone became the scapegoat of Marseille. When shipments went missing, Carbone's men. When informants died, Carbone's legacy. When resistance arms showed up in the hills, Carbone's old trucks. It didn't matter that the man was gone. In absence, he grew larger than ever. He became the shape behind every curtain, the shadow at the corner of every interrogation report. This didn't bother Spirito at first, until it did, because his own name had begun to shrink. One night, Spirito entered one of Carbone's old clubs, now under the control of a cousin of a cousin. He ordered a drink. The bartender, a boy no older than 20, asked him, "You knew Carbone, huh? Not you worked with Carbone. Not you were part of the empire. Just you knew him?" Spirito didn't answer. He finished the drink, then left without paying. The next day, the bartender was gone. Fired? Disappeared? No one said. But the message was clear. Spirito wasn't content being a footnote in someone else's legend, so he did something reckless. He started invoking Paul's name, telling stories that weren't his to tell, claiming he had Carbone's last instructions, that he alone had been left the map, that Paul had planned a return, that the machine would run again under new management. At first, it worked. People listened. Routes reopened. Even the Toulon crew, reconstituted under new leadership, sent emissaries to negotiate tribute. But then, someone called the bluff. A raid, swift, silent, precise, targeted a safe house Spirito had rebuilt using Paul's blueprints. 4 resistance members inside, 2 killed, 1 captured, 1 vanished. The Germans, when questioned, denied involvement. Spirito blamed rivals, but many knew the truth. The safe house had only been known to a handful of people, and Paul had never trusted any of them with the real locations, because Paul had changed the final routes. Only he had known the new codes. If he was gone, truly gone, then someone else had his map. Or worse, someone else was the map. And for the first time, Spirito considered something he had never once believed, that Paul had not just vanished. He had designed his own disappearance, a final operation, a fade, not a fall. And that meant Paul might still be out there, not hiding, watching. Summer 1942 melted into Marseille like ink into old paper, slow, permanent, and hard to wipe clean. The war outside was changing. The Americans had landed in North Africa. The Germans, reacting with fury and precision, had invaded the so-called free zone of southern France. And just like that, the illusion of autonomy collapsed. For Marseille, this meant full occupation. And for those who once worked under Paul Carbone's shadow, it meant survival had just become a different kind of calculation. The streets grew tighter, the silences heavier. German checkpoints multiplied like rot. ID cards were checked twice. Third time was a bullet. Spirito, more agitated by the day, found himself increasingly isolated. His name still carried fear, yes, but fear no longer kept doors open. It closed them, slower, but more final. And still Paul's name persisted. The Germans believed he was alive, not because of sightings, there were none, but because his systems were still working. Some supply lines stayed untouched. Certain resistance cells received shipments with no traceable source. And black market morphine still moved, wrapped in packing paper bearing watermarks only Carbone's presses had ever used. Someone was running something, but no one would say who, not even under torture. This mystery infuriated the occupiers. Their response? Brutal efficiency. They raided old Carbone properties, even the ones that had changed hands a dozen times. They detained anyone who had ever shared a dinner table with him. They even questioned nuns from a charity hospital he'd once anonymously funded. All claimed ignorance. All were believable, because Paul had designed it that way. His real genius, many now realized, wasn't in how he controlled people, but how he made systems self-regulate long after his presence vanished. He hadn't built a network, he'd built a nervous system, and every part knew how to retract when touched. Spirito watched this unfold with an unease he didn't recognize. He had power, but Paul had planted roots. One day, a small boy, no more than 12, showed up at one of Spirito's clubs holding a torn envelope. Inside was a note written in careful block letters. St. Charles, 2 a.m., third platform, no guards, no names. It was unsigned. Spirito almost ignored it. But something in the child's eyes, a stillness, a familiarity, made him pause. That night he went, alone. The station was nearly deserted. Just the rustle of trash, the hiss of steam, the occasional flickering lamp. He waited, watched. At exactly 2:03, a train passed, empty, except for one shadow in the final car. It looked like Paul, or a memory of him. The figure didn't wave, didn't gesture, just stood by the window, staring at Spirito as the train slid past like a ghost, then gone. No confirmation, no explanation, just presence. Spirito didn't speak of it, but something shifted in him afterward. He stopped claiming he had Paul's last instructions. He started burning documents instead of reading them. He even told one of his lieutenants, "If the old man is alive, he's made it clear. We're not meant to follow." But not everyone agreed. In Paul's absence, a new faction had begun to rise, not led by former allies, but by outsiders. Young, ruthless, unsentimental, they called themselves La Main Nue, the bare hand. They didn't use Carbone's methods. They used guns. They didn't bribe, they threatened. They didn't disappear enemies. They displayed them. One morning, a former Carbone associate was found hanging from a bridge, a sign around his neck that read, "Old rules don't apply anymore." It was effective. Fear changed hands. Spirito responded in kind. He cornered 2 bare hand leaders in a bathhouse and left their bodies in barrels near the docks, sealed with cement. But it wasn't a win. Not really. Because with every act of violence, Carbone's legacy dimmed further. His was a world of restraint, of timing, of whispers. Now, the volume was too high, and no one was conducting. Many people still think that Paul saw this coming, that his disappearance wasn't escape, but refusal. A deliberate step back from a world that no longer played his music. So what do you think? And yet, even in this crumbling system, his fingerprints remained. A police raid on a print shop uncovered old forged documents, crafted with tools no one had seen in years. When asked who taught them, the captured forger simply said, "A man who walked like silence." A customs official intercepted a freighter carrying coffee beans. Hidden inside were diamonds, opium, and an envelope addressed to a name that hadn't appeared on any manifest in over a decade. Caston Jean. That was Paul's old ghost name. Even in absence, he moved. Even in silence, he taught. Meanwhile, Marseille burned slowly, not with fire, but with attrition. Checkpoints multiplied. Rations shrank. People turned on each other for favors that never arrived. And in this decay, the question grew louder. Where was Paul Carbone? If dead, why did his machine still breathe? If alive, why did he stay gone? Spirito, once so certain, now said nothing. He simply drank more, walked less, listened too carefully to passing trains, because some part of him knew. If Paul was still watching, he wasn't coming back. Not to rescue them, not to restore order. He had already done what he came to do. And the rest? The rest was the sound of a clock winding down in an empty room. Autumn 1942 bled into Marseille like oil on stone. Thick, spreading, impossible to clean. The Germans were fully entrenched now. What had once been a port city buzzing with illicit commerce and secret pacts had transformed into a city under siege, not just from above, but from within. The air had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was weariness. And for those who had thrived in Marseille's underworld, the men and women who once danced in Paul Carbone's carefully orchestrated silence, it was becoming clear that the song had ended. What remained was noise. The bare hand faction tightened its grip. No longer content with asserting dominance, they began rewriting history. They painted murals over old brothel walls, posted flyers mocking Carbone's old codes. Where's the ghost now? They taunted. They forced former Carbone associates to kneel in public spaces and burn his symbol. A tiny silver watch face, once passed discreetly between men who never said the name aloud. And yet, the old route still worked. No one could explain why. A courier trying to reach a safe house in Lyon was cornered in Avignon, beaten, threatened. He handed over the wrong address, intentionally. Why? Because the real one still listens, he whispered before losing consciousness. The bare hand grew more paranoid. They tapped walls, bugged offices, interrogated former bookkeepers. Nothing. It didn't make sense. Then, on a foggy November morning, a bomb went off beneath a warehouse on Rue Sainte, a place Carbone once used to house counterfeit tobacco. No one was hurt. The building had been empty for months, but the timing was precise. The fuse was complex, and painted on a cracked wall, barely visible under soot, was a single Corsican word, assente, absent. Spirito saw the photograph in a police dossier 2 days later. He didn't speak, just closed the file. Stared into the middle distance. Was it Paul, or someone mimicking his ghost? Either way, the message was sharp. Even absent, Carbone set boundaries, and someone had crossed one. Around this time, another odd event occurred. A ship docked in Marseille under a false flag. An old fishing vessel, flying Greek colors, manned by 5 silent crewmen who spoke fluent French with an Algerian accent. Customs didn't find anything. But hours later, a former resistance leader, long thought to be dead, reappeared in Corsica, wearing a suit that still smelled of Marseille salt. The only clue? A folded note tucked into his jacket lining. The sea remembers who it served. The press never printed the story, but the resistance passed it like scripture. Carbone was helping again. Not openly, not widely, but deliberately, surgically. And then came the files. One morning, a magistrate's office received a stack of documents by courier. No return address, no explanation. Inside, names, bribes, shipment dates, police reports, every detail tying a major bare hand leader to Nazi collaborators. 2 days later, the man was found hanging in his office. Suicide, they said, but on his desk, a single coin was placed. Corsican franc, pre-war. No fingerprints. No prints were ever needed. Many people still think Carbone had left Marseille but kept his ear to the dock, listening for disruptions, for wrong notes in the song he'd once composed. So what do you think? Spirito became more withdrawn. His lieutenants began defecting, some to bare hand, some to the black silence of escape. Others simply disappeared. And though Spirito tried to maintain control, something inside him had cracked. The fear that had once surrounded him now hovered with less conviction. One night, he was approached in a bar by a young man, confident, well-dressed, too smooth for the room. "I heard you worked with Carbone," the boy said, smiling. Spirito didn't blink. "I buried men for Carbone," he replied. The boy chuckled. "Then maybe you should have buried him." Spirito stood. Slowly. He didn't reach for his weapon, just looked the boy in the eye. "If I had, kid," he said, "you wouldn't be standing here." The boy left, quickly, but Spirito didn't sit back down. He walked home, poured a drink, and that night, for the first time, opened Paul's sealed drawer. It held almost nothing now. A stub of the blue pen, a torn page with a map of the Marseille tunnels, a rusted compass, and a note. 4 words, no ends, just exits. He left the drawer open. The next day, Spirito left Marseille. No warning, no announcement, just gone. Some say he went to Tunis. Others claim he boarded a boat under a false name and vanished into the Atlantic trade routes Paul once used for heroin. One whisper said he made it to Argentina. Another said he was killed in Genoa, still chasing rumors of a voice he never stopped hearing. But Marseille moved on. By winter, the bare hand lost influence. Too loud, too brutal. The Germans, growing desperate, began cleaning house. New players arrived, men who didn't care about legacy or reputation, just profit. And yet, even they hesitated before touching certain addresses, because the old system still whispered. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, on the wind coming off the port, a few dock workers swore they heard footsteps, measured, slow even, not running, not fleeing, just walking like a man who never really left. By early 1943, Marseille resembled a stage long after the curtain had fallen. Scattered props, dim lights, and actors lingering in the shadows, unsure whether the show had ended or simply paused. The Germans were bleeding resources. The Vichy government had become a rickety scaffold. Resistance graffiti now outnumbered government posters. But in the hush between moments, Paul Carbone's legend refused to vanish. Not because anyone saw him, because no one could replace him. Even the newest factions, slick men with British contacts and foreign bank accounts, found themselves studying the remnants of Paul's system. They broke into old safe houses and found nothing. They traced old courier routes and found locked doors and forgotten whispers, and always, somewhere in the background, a detail would emerge that didn't make sense. A shipment moved without orders. A document forged in handwriting no one recognized. A prisoner exchanged in the night for reasons no one could explain. Paul Carbone, though absent, had become Marseille's gravitational center. The man had gone, but the field still bent around him. This was most evident one cold morning in March, when a German colonel was found dead, face down in his office. No wounds, no blood. Just a cigarette burned down to the filter, and an envelope sealed with wax. Inside, a single photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. It showed a group of men from 1927 standing in front of a brothel on Rue Paradis. Paul was at the center, smiling. That brothel had burned down in 1934. No one could explain how the photo got there. No one could explain why the colonel had been investigating old Marseille networks when he died. No one asked, but word spread, and the city listened. Not long after, a cafe owner near the docks received a handwritten order. 5 pounds of coffee, 3 tins of preserved apricots, 2 cartons of guitanes. Paid in full, in advance. The name? Jean Caston. It wasn't the first time that Alias had appeared. It wouldn't be the last. But what made this different was what came with it. A map, small, hand-drawn. It detailed a series of back alleys between St. Charles Station and an abandoned warehouse now controlled by a German logistics officer known for hoarding food supplies meant for ration cards. 3 nights later, that warehouse burned to the ground. No casualties, no arrests, but families across Marseille woke to anonymous packages on their stoops. Bread, tins, chocolate, even coffee. Each parcel stamped with a single symbol, a watch face cracked across the center. No one spoke of it publicly, but old men tipped their hats to the sky, and women lit candles not for mourning, for memory. 1 week later, a graffiti message appeared on a train tunnel wall. Le fantôme donne encore. The ghost still gives. Many people still think this was the first sign of the signal, a whisper campaign said to be orchestrated not by Carbone, but by those he had once protected. So what do you think? The signal wasn't organized. It was felt. Boxes would appear in cafés. No one saw them arrive. They'd contain lists, names, items needed, routes to avoid, and in the weeks that followed, those names were quietly moved to safety. Those items were quietly delivered. Those routes became ghost roads, untouched by patrols, never blocked. Resistance leaders began planning around the signal, though no one claimed to run it. It was like breathing in a scent you knew from childhood, impossible to describe, impossible to forget. And somewhere, hidden in those pages and smoke signals, was Paul. Not the man, the method, the lesson. Even without presence, even without command, his systems adapted. He had designed them not to obey, but to respond. A nervous system, a spine, a ghost. Meanwhile, whispers of his physical survival grew wilder. A priest claimed to have seen him at Mass in Tangier. A police informant swore he'd passed him on a train to Zurich. One French officer said he'd met a man in Algiers who matched the description. Older, slower, but with eyes that burned with maps. No proof, only echoes. But Marseille didn't need proof. They had the bakery vouchers. They had the vanished prisoners. They had the name Castan appearing on manifests that hadn't existed 5 years ago. Spirito's name had all but disappeared. The bare hand was gone, ripped apart from within by paranoia and betrayal. New men ruled now, but they all operated like tenants, never owners. One of them, young, arrogant, well-fed, once said in a brothel, "I run this street now." The madam, folding linens, looked up and said, "No, you rent it." "That's different." He laughed, but he never came back. And that's how the city worked now. Not by law, not by power, but by memory. And memory belonged to Paul Carbone, the man who once vanished, and maybe, just maybe, never really did. Spring 1943 arrived with a strange sort of quiet, the kind that feels more like suspense than peace. Marseille had changed again, but not in the way outsiders expected. It hadn't fallen into total ruin, nor had it reclaimed its former rhythms. Instead, it had become something else entirely. A city run by shadows, guided by instincts, and haunted by a man who may or may not have still drawn breath. At street level, the city pulsed with contradictions. German troops still marched past shuttered shops, their boots ringing sharp against the cobbles. Resistance fighters still vanished into alleys and rooftops. But beneath it all, a different kind of order had reasserted itself. Not the order of Vichy, not even the ruthlessness of the bare hand. It was quieter, more deliberate. Certain couriers started using old Carbone routes again. Certain codes returned to circulation. And most tellingly, shipments of forged papers, uncannily perfect ones, began surfacing in key resistance pockets. Each paper bore a watermark no one had seen since 1939, a faint outline of a cracked watch face, and everyone who saw it understood Paul was back, or someone who knew how he worked, down to the pen stroke. The question wasn't, is he alive? The question was, how long has he been watching? That month, an encrypted message was intercepted by a German listening post in Toulon. It was simple, just a list of coordinates, a date, and a phrase in Corsican dialect. The ledger breathes, "You are not alone." 2 weeks later, an armory north of Marseille exploded in the middle of the night. No survivors, no leads, but a fisherman swore he saw a man watching from a boat off the coast. Said he was tall, wore a gray coat, smoked with his left hand. Nothing remarkable, until he mentioned the man had a slight limp. The Germans brushed it off, but the resistance didn't. They began coordinating again, not loosely, not desperately, but surgically, as if they had guidance, as if someone had handed them a map written in shadows. And then came the letter, delivered by a schoolteacher to a resistance leader in X. Inside, no greeting, no sign-off, just instructions. At dawn, the train at platform 4. The guard will hesitate. The crate marked with a red triangle. Inside, enough to turn the tide into Toulouse. Don't be late. This route expires with the sunrise. They followed the instructions, found the crate. Inside, weapons, forged passes, morphine, cash, and beneath it all, a folded card with a name scrawled in delicate, unmistakable blue ink. Carbone. No one questioned its authenticity. They knew. But why now? Why emerge even indirectly when the city had already adapted? Some said it was pride. Others said it was unfinished business. But a few, those who had known Paul personally, whispered a different theory, that he had never been gone at all, that his so-called death in the train accident had been orchestrated by Paul himself, that Spirito had known, had helped, that the years between 1943 and that fateful March morning had been a masterclass in subtraction, a way for Paul to disappear not just from public life, but from the reach of memory, because if people stopped asking about him, he could move again, operate again. And now, with the Allies pressing from the south and resistance growing louder, the time had come to tilt the board one last time. He didn't need an empire. He needed an ending. That's what many believed anyway. Then came the vanishing house. A safe house used for over a decade by Carbone's network suddenly disappeared. Not collapsed, not raided. Disappeared. Beds still made. Coffee still warm on the stove. Not a soul inside. Maps gone. Typewriter missing. A single lit candle left on the kitchen table. Next to it, a note pinned with a rusted nail. This route is closed. Time rewrites the clever. The ghost returns only once. There were no more sightings for weeks. No more shipments. No more notes. But Marseille changed again. Resistance activity increased. Better organized. More targeted. German transports were intercepted with uncanny precision. Collaborators began surrendering not to the authorities, but to shadowy intermediaries who never gave names. Only offers. Some claimed these intermediaries were new recruits. Others called them something else. Les Intacts, the untouched. A network of untouched, untraceable operatives believed to be trained by Carbone in the years leading up to his supposed death. No one could prove they existed, but their fingerprints matched nothing. Their accents were neutral, and they always disappeared before the second question was asked. Meanwhile, a high-level Vichy defector passed through Marseille en route to Spain. His route was protected, cleared in advance. He traveled safely, and in his pocket, without his knowledge, was a letter, not addressed to him, just a folded page with a message. You passed through me. I remain. But you may keep the warmth. It cost you more than gold. He read it on the border. No one saw him speak for days. Many people still think Paul wrote it himself. So what do you think? Marseille didn't cheer, didn't mourn. It just adjusted. Because that's what cities do when their ghosts return. They blink. Then they carry on. And this time it wasn't about control. It was about legacy. And Paul Carbone's was no longer a man. It was a method still breathing in the cracks of war. By the summer of 1943, the world outside Marseille had turned louder, brighter, more desperate. The Allies had landed in Sicily. The German grip on France was tightening, but its hands were shaking. Battles were being lost. Territories slipped through their fingers like sand in a cracked glove, and yet Marseille remained what it always was, a border town in spirit, wedged between waves and war, corruption and courage. But something subtle had changed. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was awareness. People began moving differently, slower, quieter. Doors were left ajar with purpose. Cafe owners gave discounts to certain strangers. Couriers walked with maps they didn't remember memorizing. And always, somewhere behind it all, there was that same name, whispered like prayer, written like riddle. Carbone. Paul's legend had matured. It no longer needed him. It had become a self-sustaining truth, flexible enough to stretch into myth, firm enough to guide the frightened. Yet still, things happened that only he could explain. One night, a German patrol intercepted a caravan believed to be transporting weapons to resistance forces. They raided it mid-bridge, forced the drivers to the ground, opened every crate. Inside, nothing but fabric bolts and bricks of lavender soap, all legal, all useless, except hidden in the soap's packaging was a scent, faint, almost forgotten. It was the blend Paul used to wear, not available since 1938. The soldiers didn't notice, but the resistance contact watching from the shadows smiled. Paul's way wasn't to shout. It was to whisper just loud enough that the right person heard. Later that week, another coincidence. A truck meant for a Vichy supply depot never arrived. Its driver claimed he got lost, detoured by a man in a gray coat at the last checkpoint who gave him alternate directions with a forged pass. The checkpoint, never manned. The uniform, never registered. But the driver said one thing that chilled the resistance leader who questioned him. He had a limp, the driver said, but he walked like the road was his. Marseille started calling him le dernier chef, the last boss, a term of respect, but also of resignation, because if Paul was back, truly back, then maybe he wasn't here to stay. Maybe he was here to end something. A rumor began to circulate that Paul Carbone was assembling his final ledger, not a book of accounts, but a list of who had remained loyal, of who had betrayed the old codes, of who deserved passage, and who would be left behind. Some even claimed they'd received visits, old contacts, former runners, retired smugglers. A soft knock, a voice they hadn't heard in years, always the same question. Would you do it again? If they said yes, nothing more happened. If they hesitated, they were never approached again. One man, a former harbor lookout, said he found a coin under his doorstep the next morning. A coin split in two. One half in his hand, the other half buried in the bricks nearby. The message was clear. You had been measured, and you didn't pass. Many people still think that Paul was using these visits to select the skeleton crew for something larger. A last operation. Unseen but precise. The kind only whispered about in footnotes and footlockers. So what do you think? Meanwhile, Spirito's name surfaced briefly. A French agent in Morocco claimed he saw him boarding a boat to Brazil. Another said he was arrested in a hotel in Lisbon, but released after paying a bribe in diamonds. And yet another claimed Spirito had been killed in Buenos Aires, mistaken for someone else. No one ever confirmed anything. It almost didn't matter, because Marseille had stopped waiting for those men. They were phantoms now. And Paul had become something else entirely. Not quite alive, not quite gone. One night, a child in Le Panier district wandered into the ruins of an old brothel, chasing a lost ball. Inside, beneath a collapsed stairwell, he found a door ajar. The room behind it was empty, except for a single item on the table, a cracked wristwatch, still ticking. Its hands pointed to 11:47. There was no battery inside, the boy told his father. The father told no one, but he changed their family name the next week to Carbone. It meant nothing officially, but in Marseille names have gravity, and that gravity still orbited Paul. Even the Germans, now retreating piece by piece, began referring to certain corners of the port as zones fantômes, ghost zones, areas where they lost men, where messages vanished, where orders never arrived. They blamed sabotage, but the resistance knew better. Those zones had been his, still were in a way, and every month that passed, Marseille softened into a city waiting for a curtain to fall. No fireworks, no fanfare, just the end of a long, quiet song, written in silence, signed by a hand that may never return, but whose ink never fades. Autumn returned with its muted gold and breathless wind, brushing Marseille's rooftops like fingers over piano keys long untuned. The war had entered its final movement, though few knew it yet. The Allies advanced from the south. Rome was cracking. Paris whispered of revolt, but Marseille waited, not for liberation, for resolution. And in the alleys and cellars of that waiting, Paul Carbone's name was no longer spoken with urgency. It was breathed, like incense at dusk, meant less for ears and more for the space between them, because he had become ritual. That month, a resistance printer, working out of a bookstore in Cours Julian, received an anonymous package. Inside, freshly typeset flyers calling for mass civil disobedience, timed with the anticipated Allied push. The paper stock traced to a warehouse Paul had once owned, long since condemned. The font, a rare italic variant last used by one of Paul's forgers in 1935. Attached to the package, a short, handwritten note. Ink still remembers the hand. The operation went flawlessly. Not a single arrest. Every flyer posted within an hour. 3 collaborators fled the city the next day. Someone was organizing this, but no one took credit. Not the resistance, not the Gaullists, not the communists. It wasn't coordination, it was choreography. And at the heart of that dance, if you followed the tempo close enough, you still heard the steps of a man with a limp and a blue ink pen. Meanwhile, small miracles unfolded. A girl whose father had vanished in a German roundup found a map tucked into her school bag. It led her to a bakery. There, beneath a loose floor tile, she found ration books and a photo of her family, one she didn't know existed. The bakery had closed in 1941. No one knew who opened it that day. The girl kept the map, folded it 13 times, and never told anyone what she whispered to the cracked watch face she found hidden in the flour sack. Marseille wasn't asking where Paul was anymore. It was asking when, because the city knew he wouldn't appear for glory. He would appear for necessity. And that necessity came in December. A senior Gestapo officer was due to transfer out, carrying with him a dossier detailing hundreds of resistance safe houses, names, plans, photos. It was a death sentence in a leather binder. The resistance scrambled to intercept him. Nothing worked. Guards were too tight. Trains were rescheduled without notice. Then, the morning of the officer's departure, the binder vanished from his desk. No forced entry, no fingerprints, just an open window with no fire escape. And in its place, a single playing card. An old Corsican Tarocco, faded and curled. The Knight of Coins. A merchant, a builder, a man whose power lay in passage. Paul's old symbol. That night, 5 resistance leaders met in an attic to discuss the theft. None had orchestrated it. None knew who had, but all agreed on one thing. Someone was still out there. Someone who knew the blueprint. And not just Paul's blueprint, Marseille's. Its heart, its arteries, its secrets. One man said, maybe he never left. Another said, maybe we just stopped seeing him. And someone else added, maybe that was the point. Many people still think this was the night the idea of the archive was born. A mythical collection of Carbone's secrets, safe houses, and contacts, hidden across the city in pieces, waiting to be reassembled only when Marseille truly needed saving. So what do you think? The archive was never confirmed, but stories grew of children finding coins in forgotten stairwells, of couriers following maps left under church pews, of briefcases locked with keys no one remembered forging, all signed the same way, a crack in a watch, not a signature, a suggestion. Meanwhile, a final figure reemerged, Spirito, not in person but in rumor. An Italian journalist claimed he had spoken to him in Casablanca, working under a new name, selling passage to fugitives. He asked if Carbone was alive. Spirito's answer? Alive? He's more than that. He's Marseille. The quote ran once, then vanished. The paper that printed it was raided 2 days later, but the words stuck, because they felt true. By early January 1944, the resistance no longer planned alone. They waited for signs, for directions not written by hand, but left in breadcrumbs. The angle of a shutter, the tilt of a lamppost, a door left slightly ajar, and always, the question behind every closed conversation. Is this Carbone's doing? Sometimes it was, sometimes not, but no one dared move without asking. That was legacy. Not fear, not fame, but pause. A city pausing, not because it lacked direction, but because it remembered the cost of choosing the wrong one. And Paul Carbone had always chosen with precision. So now, so would they. January 1944 turned colder than expected, and Marseille seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The city was no longer under total occupation, nor entirely free. It was suspended, between tides, between ghosts. And in this quiet threshold, the question that had lingered in back rooms and safe houses now surfaced more plainly in the open. Was Paul Carbone still alive? By then, no one expected to see him strolling through Rue de Rome in his old camel coat. The years had passed. War had aged everyone, even legends. But stories still emerged, flickers in the fog. A waiter swore he'd served a man in a gray overcoat who tipped with a 1932 silver franc and asked after a woman named Odette. No last name, just Odette. An old woman in Undoom found a gold tie clip in her coat pocket, one she hadn't worn since 1939. It was hers, yes, but it had been missing for 4 years, and one morning, a priest unlocked his confessional and found an envelope on the kneeler. Inside, names, German informants, collaborators, each confirmed, each vanished by the week's end. No one took credit. But in each location, on a shutter, on a gate, on a stone, someone had etched the faint outline of a watch, cracked down the middle. It was no longer about belief. It was about pattern. Something, someone was still moving. But why? Why now? The war was tipping. The Allies pressed harder. French resistance cells grew bolder. German patrols thinned. Many expected chaos. Instead, they got discipline. Smugglers stopped undercutting one another. Routes were shared. Weapons were distributed where they were needed. Not hoarded, not bartered. A whisper spread. Carbone's code has returned. What was it? A philosophy more than a rule book. Built on silence, loyalty, precision. No one kept it in writing. But those who had worked under Paul once knew its rhythm. You didn't speak unless the air permitted. You didn't move unless the map agreed. You didn't strike unless it solved 3 problems at once. Now the younger fighters, barely men, were following it too. They didn't know why. They just knew it worked. And then, something rare. A letter published anonymously in Le Vent du Sud, an underground Marseille paper. It read, "To those who still ask, I am not your leader. I am not your savior. I am the echo you built your courage around. I am every decision made with care. Do not seek me. Seek what we made. When the lights return, burn this letter and walk forward without fear." No signature, no confirmation, but the font was familiar, the punctuation oddly formal, the closing cadence unmistakable. Spirito, wherever he was, read it too. According to one hotel concierge in Tangier, a man matching his description read the article, stared into his espresso for 10 minutes, and murmured, "He's signing off." Then he checked out, left no forwarding address. Some say that was Paul's final goodbye. Others disagreed, because the signs didn't stop. If anything, they became more surgical. A corrupt local officer with ties to the Gestapo was found in a church pew, alive, unharmed, but shaken. In his coat pocket, a single sentence written in blue ink. "We remember your daughter's birthday." The next day he resigned. No one asked why. Another man, a petty arms dealer with loose lips, was discovered gagged and bound in the old underground catacombs. Not dead, just left. With a note, too loud, and always, always, the same calling card, the cracked watch face. It was never flamboyant, never cruel, just precise. Many people still think Paul had set the system on a final loop, a kind of last will autopilot, a sequence of safeguards, messages, and trigger points activated only when Marseille's temperature reached a certain threshold. So what do you think? Did the man survive, or did the method outlive him? One resistance leader put it like this: if he's alive, he's a lighthouse. If he's dead, he's a compass. Either way, he points. But even compasses can lose alignment, and February brought a complication. A foreign syndicate, slick men from Antwerp with Swiss accents and American cigars, began making moves on the port. Not subtle ones, not local ones. They didn't ask, they demanded. Bought a few dock workers, bribed a few warehouse guards, and just like that, tried to set up shop on Carbone's bones. It didn't last long. One morning, their lead negotiator, flanked by 2 armed men, walked into a cafe to meet a contact. He never came out. No one saw a struggle, but when police entered, they found all 3 seated in silence, alive, unmarked, and staring forward, stunned. On the table before them, 3 watches, identical, each cracked, each ticking at a different rhythm. They left Marseille the next day, never returned. The message was simple: this city may be bruised, but the ghost still kept its balance. March 1944 arrived beneath a sky the color of old iron, and Marseille braced itself not for bombs or battles, but for endings. The war wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. In the distance, Allied boots pressed into Italy. The Atlantic roared with convoys headed for Normandy. Across France, resistance networks flourished like veins reconnecting with a long-forgotten heartbeat. But Marseille remained different. The city no longer looked for leaders. It followed signs, and the signs still bore his fingerprint. Not in declarations, not in parades, but in things left just slightly out of place. A red scarf tied around a lamppost, indicating a building had been cleared. 3 coffee beans placed neatly on a windowsill, meaning safe to talk. A watch, always cracked, always ticking, meaning someone still watches. And then a twist. On March 12th, a high-ranking German logistician was kidnapped. Not by known resistance fighters, not by any group claiming responsibility. Just taken. Witnesses reported nothing. No struggle, no gunfire. Only a delivery truck that never reached its destination and was later found. Empty, door ajar, with the radio still humming a jazz tune no one remembered recording. The man reappeared 3 days later on the steps of the Spanish consulate. Alive, confused, mouth sealed. In his pocket, a note in delicate, old-fashioned French cursive. You took too much. Be thankful we asked first. He defected the next day. Another message arrived shortly after. Left inside the confessional of Saint Laurent. Marseille has already chosen. The war will end here in silence. The resistance took it as a signal. They began preparing, not for battle, but for transition. For a city to slip out of war's grasp like smoke through a sailor's hands. A week later, a train carrying stolen Jewish archives derailed outside Marseille. No casualties. All documents recovered, passed anonymously to the underground. Each page stamped inexplicably with a small ink blot in the shape of a watch's face. The archivist who found them didn't question it. He just whispered, "He's still cleaning the room." Because that's what it felt like. Like Paul Carbone, whether alive or long buried, was tidying his legacy, smoothing wrinkles, tying loose ends, preparing Marseille for its next costume change. Many people still think he was tying off the network, a web of favors, debts, codes, and silent enforcers that had stretched from Corsica to Cairo, only now pulling back, coiling in, ready to vanish like breath on cold glass. So what do you think? Could a man engineer a disappearance so complete that even his absence would behave like a presence? Because that's what was happening. Spirito's name disappeared entirely. Even the rumor mills stopped grinding it. The bare hand? Forgotten. Their graffitied symbols painted over by careful, anonymous hands. Their last safe house turned into a children's clinic, funded by cash whose origins no one dared question. And the new players, slick suits from Paris, hardened smugglers from the coast, steered clear of the old docks, not out of fear, out of respect, because there were places in Marseille you simply didn't touch, even if the man who built them was dust. A café in Le Panier began serving under a new name, L'Ombre, the shadow. The owner, an old man with a limp, always reading, who never gave his real name, but his eyes, those deep, Atlantic-colored eyes, watched every transaction like a chessboard. One day, a boy delivered groceries there and accidentally dropped a bottle of wine. The man didn't scold him, just smiled, reached into his pocket, handed him a coin, split in half. The boy didn't understand, but his mother did. She didn't let him go back there, not because it was dangerous, because it wasn't his time yet. In April, a resistance officer received an envelope sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. Inside, the locations of 6 caches of weapons and food. All real, all untouched, all dated from 1941. He asked around. No one claimed responsibility. But every older fighter he asked had the same response. You're not the first to find Paul's leftovers. Because by now, Carbone's legend wasn't about action. It was about design. He'd laid down futures like some men lay minefields. Carefully, precisely, with a timetable no one could see but him. A girl found a page of his old ledgers lining a bird cage in her grandmother's attic. A baker received a flour shipment with Paul's initials branded on a bag buried at the bottom. A man in Algiers swore he met Paul's brother, except Paul never had a brother. Or did he? These weren't leads. They were echoes, carefully curated, politely persistent, and Marseille listened, because by then they understood. Paul hadn't died. He'd rehearsed his exit until even time applauded, and when he finally vanished, the silence left behind behaved like a structure, not emptiness, architecture. And every resistance fighter still breathing in 1944 knew that architecture by feel, even if they couldn't name the architect. The summer of 1944 rolled in slowly, humid and thick with the scent of endings. Marseille, battered but not broken, now moved with a kind of reverent restraint, like a grand hotel still running on candlelight, its former guests long gone, but the staff still dressed in tuxedos, just in case someone important might return. But the city wasn't waiting anymore. It was remembering. The resistance had matured into a quiet bureaucracy of survival. Checkpoints manned, safe houses rotated, street signs subtly altered to misdirect German patrols. Not chaotic, not frantic, precise. The kind of precision that bore the unmistakable imprint of Paul Carbone's style. Even in his absence, he remained Marseille's architect. One day, a shipment of American rifles appeared in the hands of a resistance cell that had never made contact with Allied forces. The cache was buried beneath an abandoned stable, wrapped in oilskin, tagged with a label in careful French handwriting for when the timing matches the courage. The stable hadn't been touched in 4 years. They never found who buried it, just like they never found the man who warned a doctor to leave the city the night before his arrest, or the voice who guided 2 young couriers out of a trap using only matchstick patterns left on a windowsill. Paul or not Paul, at that point, it didn't matter, because Marseille had begun behaving like him, as if his city had internalized his instincts, absorbed his caution, inherited his timing. In July, a German officer turned himself in to the resistance, said he was done, said he'd received a letter from someone with too many eyes and too much quiet. He wouldn't say more, but when they searched his belongings, they found a single coin tucked into his boot, split down the middle. The final push came weeks later. Allied tanks closing in, German infrastructure in disarray. The resistance rose not in rebellion, but in orchestration. Sabotage points activated, docks reclaimed, bridges spared, files protected. No panic, no grandstand, just execution, silent, flawless, exactly how Paul would have done it. And then, on the evening of August 21st, just hours before liberation, an anonymous message was left at the door of a radio operator. The last lock has been lifted. The house is no longer haunted. Keep the door open. Marseille walks forward now. Signed only with a watch. The next morning, the Allies entered. The city didn't cheer as loudly as Paris would. It didn't wave flags from every window, but the streets were clean. The dead had already been buried, the maps already updated, and the men who tried to rush into leadership found themselves politely ignored, because Marseille didn't need saving. It had saved itself, and somewhere, not far from the harbor, an old man sat at a café, reading a newspaper in the shade. He had a limp, smoked with his left hand, tipped generously in francs no longer minted. When the waiter asked his name, he smiled. Jean Castan, just passing through. No one followed him. No one needed to, because Paul Carbone had already made his exit, and the city he built, layer by layer, silence by silence, remained standing. No statues were raised in his name. No parades played his song. But Marseille's tempo had changed forever, and if you listen closely, especially at dusk, when the tram's quiet and the water licks the old stone docks, you might still hear the pulse of him, not in words, in method, in restraint, in the deliberate space between danger and decision, a rhythm written by a man who vanished twice, first from life, then from legend, leaving behind not a legacy, but a design. And now, as the echoes of old Marseille soften into the night, we let the noise recede. Picture the quiet sea beyond the port, lapping gently against ancient walls, still wet with memory. The trams have stopped. The alley cats have settled. The street lamps flicker not out of fear, but fatigue. The city breathes now, not in survival, but in rest. Paul Carbone's footsteps have long since faded, but something of him remains, tucked into the crevices of old doors and the rhythm of trusted hands passing envelopes. His was never a reign of thunder. It was rain, steady, precise, invisible if you didn't know where to feel for it. And perhaps that's what lingers most, the carefulness, the way he moved through the world, not by force, but by adjustment. How his silence rewrote rooms. How his memory builds itself, not in monuments, but in the way Marseille still folds its secrets into soft corners. You don't need to remember every name or every turn in the story. Just remember how it made you feel. The quiet tension, the whispered safety, the architecture of a ghost who didn't haunt but held. So, wherever you are tonight, whether in a high-rise with humming lights or a quiet room with open windows, breathe slower now. Let the rhythm ease. You're safe. Marseille is sleeping. And the ghost? He's finally let go.